Hi guys, and welcome to History That Makes You Sleepy tonight. You arrived just a little too late. A thin layer of ash drifts slowly through the air, settling softly on your shoulders, light as snow but warmer than it should be. You brush it away without thinking, only to notice how quiet everything is. No footsteps, no distant voices, not even the sound of wind. Just a stillness that feels unnatural. You take a slow breath, and there is a faint, bitter taste in the air. It lingers longer than expected. You pause, because something here does not quite make sense, and the more you notice, the clearer it becomes. If you were truly standing here, you would not have time to understand it. You probably would not survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And don't forget to share your location and local time in the comments. I always enjoy seeing where in the world you're listening from. Now, dim the lights, flow straight into the story. You stand at the edge of the frontier settlement while ash continues drifting across the snow. At first, you think it comes from chimneys. That would make sense. A cabin fire. A cook stove, somebody burning pine logs while children sleep beneath heavy blankets nearby. But the chimneys are cold, the roofs wear snow undisturbed by heat. Windows remain dark, doors stay shut. The settlement looks paused, almost preserved, like a painting forgotten in an attic, somewhere nearby. Wood creaks softly as the temperature drops another degree. The sound carries strangely far in winter air. You pull your coat tighter. The year is somewhere in the late 19th century, though frontier winters tend to blur together after a while. One storm resembles another. One frozen morning resembles the next. Families live in across the American plains, the Canadian prairie, and scattered mountain territories often measured time not by calendars but by survival. Before the railroad fully connected these regions, entire homesteads could vanish beneath snowdrifts for weeks. You begin walking slowly between cabins. Your boots crunch through old snow crusted hard as stale bread. Every sound feels too loud. The silence presses against your ears until you almost miss the faint whistle of wind slipping through gaps in timber walls. A mainstream historical detail often overlooked today is just how isolated these frontier families truly were. Some homesteads sat miles apart across open prairie. During winter storms, visibility vanished completely. A person could become lost only a few yards from home. In the terrible blizzard of 1888, sometimes called the Schoolhouse Blizzard, sudden freezing winds killed hundreds across the Great Plains, including children trying to return home through whiteout conditions. The storm arrived so quickly that morning skies had seemed almost pleasant beforehand. Frontier weather enjoyed practical jokes with fatal endings. You stop near a wagon half buried in snow. The wheels protrude like old bones from the drift. Canvas hangs stiff with frost. A cooking pot lies upside down nearby, frozen into the ground. You notice how small everything feels. Frontier life in paintings often appears heroic and expansive. Real settlements were cramped, smoky, muddy, and perpetually tired. Historians continue debating whether many settlers fully understood the climates they moved into, or whether optimism simply outweighed caution. Land advertisements promised fertile opportunity, but advertisements rarely included details about waking to ice forming inside your bedroom wall. Funny how sales brochures leave out the part where your soup freezes before breakfast. You reach the centre of the settlement where a narrow church stands beneath heavy snow. The bell rope hangs motionless. Even now, churches often served multiple roles on the frontier: worship space, meeting hall, storm shelter, temporary hospital, sometimes even funeral home. Efficiency becomes important when your nearest town sits 40 freezing miles away and your horse already looks emotionally exhausted. The ash still drifts. Eventually you realize what it actually is. Not ash, snow. Fine powder blown high into the air earlier during the storm and only now settling gently back down. Your mind simply mistook it for ash because the settlement feels burned out somehow, emotionally emptied. Frontier winters had a talent for making ordinary scenes resemble the aftermath of catastrophe. You pass a cabin window and glimpse movement inside. A face disappears instantly behind frosted glass. So there are people here after all. Of course there are. Frontier families became experts at conserving energy during winter. Doors remained shut. Heat stayed trapped. Movement slowed. Nobody wandered casually outdoors because every trip into the cold spent precious calories. Even breathing hurt sometimes. Air this cold bites the inside of your nose. Your eyelashes gather frost. Your fingers stiffen despite gloves. You finally approach one cabin with smoke barely rising from its chimney. The smell reaches you first. Pine sap, damp wool, burnt stew, a faint animal scent carried from nearby sheds. Honestly, frontier winter survival involved far more livestock aroma than modern historical dramas usually admit. The Old West smelled less like cinematic freedom and more like wet boots and nervous chickens. A quirky detail from some frontier communities reveals that people occasionally slept with potatoes in bed during extreme cold. Not because potatoes are emotionally comforting, though perhaps they tried their best, but because warmed potatoes wrapped in cloth could briefly hold heat beneath blankets. Imagine explaining that to a luxury mattress company today. You climb the cabin steps carefully. Ice coats the wood smooth as glass. Inside, somebody coughs. A child maybe, and silence again. The cabin itself is tiny. Most frontier homes measured far smaller than modern living rooms. Entire families cooked, slept, worked, and survived within spaces that trapped smoke near the ceiling and cold beneath the floorboards. During blizzards, cabins became worlds unto themselves. Outside ceased to exist beyond white darkness and screaming wind. You place one hand against the wall. The logs feel solid but imperfect. Tiny cracks snake between them where mud and chinking struggle to hold back winter air. Families constantly repaired these gaps because cold entered patiently, almost intelligently, searching every weakness. And winter on the frontier was patient. That may be the most frightening part. Not dramatic violence, not sudden disaster, just endless endurance. Endless maintenance, endless wood chopping, hauling water, patching roofs, checking animals, drying socks beside weak fires while snow piles higher outside. You hear low voices inside now, a woman speaking softly, a kettle lid rattling. Somewhere deeper in the cabin. A dog sighs with the theatrical exhaustion of a creature forced to witness human decisions. Frontier dogs worked hard, but they also mastered the ancient survival strategy of finding the warmest possible spot and refusing to move under any circumstance short of bacon. The wind begins rising again, snow brushes against your coat in thin waves, dust settles slowly across the settlement, blue and heavy. One by one, faint orange lights appear behind frosted windows. Families preparing for another long night. You look back across the silent cabins and finally understand something important. These people are not surviving because the frontier makes them stronger. They survive because every ordinary task has become serious. Every coal matters. Every blanket matters. Every bucket of water carried before the storm matters. The romantic image comes later. The reality is this quiet, this cold, this constant awareness that nature does not hate you personally. It simply does not notice you at all, and somewhere beyond the darkening prairie, another storm is already gathering its strength. The wind follows you across the settlement as evening settles deeper into the snow. Behind cabin windows, faint firelight flickers like distant lanterns aboard ships lost at sea. The comparison feels strangely accurate. Frontier cabins during winter often behaved less like homes and more like survival vessels drifting through storms. You step toward the cabin with the smoking chimney. Closer now, you notice details hidden by dusk before. Animal hides hang stiff beside the door. A stack of chopped wood leans beneath a crude awning already sagging under fresh snow. Someone has stuffed old fabric into gaps around the frame to keep drafts out. It looks improvised because it is improvised. Frontier architecture frequently involves solving problems 5 minutes before freezing to death from them. The door opens suddenly. Warmth does not exactly rush out. Frontier warmth rarely rushed anywhere. Instead, a tired wave of smoky heat drifts across your face carrying scents of stew, damp wool, pine resin, and human survival. You enter carefully, stomping snow from your boots. The cabin interior glows amber beneath firelight. It's smaller than expected, almost shockingly small. One room serves every purpose imaginable. Cooking area, bedroom, workshop, nursery, dining room, storage, sick room, occasionally battlefield against invading mice. A loft overhead holds extra blankets and supplies. Shadows gather between rafters blackened by years of smoke. A woman kneels beside the hearth, feeding thin logs into the fire. Sparks rise briefly before vanishing into darkness above. Nearby, 2 children sit wrapped in quilts so oversized they resemble sleepy caterpillars preparing for winter migration. The father removes heavy gloves beside the door. His beard carries tiny crystals of ice still melting slowly. He nods politely toward you with the exhausted expression shared by parents everywhere across history. The universal look that says yes, everyone is alive. But only barely, and please do not ask complicated questions right now. You settle quietly onto a rough wooden bench. The cabin walls creak softly as wind presses against them. That sound never fully disappears during frontier winters. Timber contracts in cold temperatures. Roof beams groan. Frost shifts. Sometimes entire cabins pop suddenly during the night like distant gunshots, which must have been deeply comforting for already anxious settlers trying to sleep beside candlelight. The woman places a kettle near the flames. Immediately you notice how carefully everyone moves around heat. Nothing is wasted. Firewood required brutal labour to gather and chop before snow arrived. In heavily wooded regions, families spent entire seasons preparing enough fuel for winter survival on open prairie, where trees were scarce. Some settlers even burned dried animal dung for heat. Not glamorous, certainly. But frontier survival often demanded abandoning personal dignity in favour of remaining alive until spring. A widely accepted historical reality is that poorly built cabins could become deadly during severe winters. Many early homesteaders constructed shelters quickly before cold weather arrived, using green wood that later shrank and created gaps. Snow entered constantly. Wind found every weakness. Families hung quilts against the walls or packed mud into cracks simply to reduce airflow. You watch the father inspect the windows. They are tiny, partly because glass remained expensive, and partly because large windows lost heat rapidly. Frost feathers spread across the inside corners despite the fire burning nearby. Imagine paying modern energy bills for a cabin where winter physically enters the room and sits beside you uninvited. One child coughs softly. The mother glances over immediately. That small sound changes the atmosphere for a moment. Illness during frontier winters frightened families deeply. A mild fever today could become tragedy within days if weather prevented travel for help. Isolation transformed ordinary sickness into serious danger. Outside, the wind rises harder. Snow rattles against the roof in dry waves. The dog sleeping near the hearth lifts one eye briefly, before deciding this situation still does not require participation. An admirable level of emotional boundary setting, honestly. You notice bundles hanging from ceiling beams, herbs drying slowly, strips of preserved meat, wool socks turned inside out near the fire. Every object inside the cabin serves a purpose. Decorative clutter belongs mostly to wealthier futures not yet invented here. Historians still disagree about how emotionally prepared many immigrant families were for frontier isolation, compared to the crowded communities they left behind in Europe or eastern cities. Some diary accounts describe overwhelming loneliness during winter months, endless white landscapes, endless wind, endless repetition of chores beneath grey skies. And yet people adapted. Humans always do, eventually. The father begins packing fresh mud into a thin crack near the floorboards using a blunt knife. Cold air slips through even now, brushing across your ankles. Frontier cabins breathed constantly. Warm air escaped upward while freezing drafts entered below. Entire households fought an endless, invisible battle against temperature. Some families nailed animal skins directly against interior walls for extra insulation. Others stuffed moss between logs. A few wealthier settlers ordered manufactured materials from distant towns, though delivery during winter remained uncertain at best. Frontier shipping schedules tended to operate according to a sophisticated system called, perhaps eventually. The kettle begins steaming. One child inches closer immediately. You cannot blame him. Warmth becomes magnetic during long winters. People gathered around hearths not only for heat but for reassurance. Firelight created emotional comfort as much as physical survival. Beyond those walls waited darkness capable of killing livestock, freezing water solid, and trapping families indoors for days. A strange historical tidbit survives from some prairie communities, where people occasionally slept wearing nightcaps stuffed with feathers or rabbit fur. Heat escapes rapidly through the head, and frontier winters encouraged creative fashion decisions. Modern sleep influencers have weighted blankets. Frontier settlers had aggressively insulated hats and unresolved respiratory problems from smoke inhalation. The mother finally serves thin stew into wooden bowls. Everyone eats slowly. Conversation remains soft and practical. Wood supply, weather signs, condition of the mule, whether tomorrow might allow travel to the neighbouring homestead. Frontier families often developed calm speaking habits during winter, because shouting wasted energy and frightened children already nervous about storms. You taste the stew, mostly broth, a few vegetables, perhaps rabbit. Still, after hours in freezing air, it feels astonishingly comforting. Heat spreads gradually through your hands as you cradle the bowl. Outside, snow continues piling against the cabin walls in slow, patient layers. The father glances toward the roof. You hear it then? Not wind exactly. Weight. Fresh snow settling above the rafters. Cabin maintenance never ended during frontier winters. Roofs collapsed. Chimneys cracked. Doors froze shut overnight. Survival depended on constant observation. People learned to notice tiny changes in sound and temperature because missing them carried consequences. The fire pops suddenly. Orange light flickers across tired faces. You realize something important while sitting here among smoke. Damp boots and whispering walls. Frontier families survived not through dramatic heroism, but through routines repeated endlessly. Chop wood, melt snow, patch cracks, feed animals, protect children, sleep lightly, wake early, repeat until spring. Romantic paintings rarely include the smell of wet wool drying beside a weak fire, but that smell was real. That smell meant people were still alive, and outside the cabin, the storm keeps building quietly in the dark. The stew disappears slowly from the bowls while snow thickens outside the cabin walls. Nobody rushes the meal. Frontier winters teach people to treat warmth carefully, almost respectfully, because warmth vanishes quickly once neglected. The mother scrapes the bottom of the iron pot with a wooden spoon. Very little remains. You notice how everyone watches the pot without obviously watching it. Children especially. Not greedy exactly, just aware. Frontier families learned early that food supplies behaved like hourglasses during winter. Every scoop taken tonight meant slightly less tomorrow. The fire crackles softly beside you. Its heat reaches only part way across the room. One side of your body feels warm while the other still remembers the cold outdoors. That strange half-frozen sensation belonged to everyday frontier life. Even indoors, winter never completely left the room. The father hangs damp gloves near the hearth. Steam rises faintly from the wool. The smell joins dozens of others already filling the cabin. Wood smoke, soup broth, wet leather, melted snow, animal fur, human exhaustion. None of it unpleasant exactly, or just dense, lived in, honest. You hear the kettle beginning to murmur again. Hot water mattered constantly during frontier winters. For tea, for washing, for softening frozen food, for easing coughs. Sometimes simply for holding between cold hands while pretending morale remained excellent. Which, to be fair, is still a respected survival strategy today. A commonly accepted historical fact is that frontier diets during winter became repetitive very quickly. Families depended heavily on preserved foods because fresh produce disappeared for months. Salted pork, dried beans, cornmeal, pickled vegetables, hard bread, smoked meat, and whatever root vegetables survived, storage cellars carried many households through the season. You glance toward a shelf beside the wall. Glass jars line the boards unevenly. Preserved berries, pickles, something pale floating in cloudy liquid that you decide not to investigate too deeply for emotional reasons. Frontier cooking occasionally operated under the principle of, if it has not killed us yet, perhaps supper remains possible. The mother tears stale bread into smaller pieces and drops them carefully into broth for the children. Nothing is wasted, not crumbs, not grease, not leftover bones. Even weak soup carried calories needed for chopping wood, hauling water, or walking through deep snow tomorrow. One child licks the spoon thoughtfully afterward. You respect the commitment. Outside, wind brushes snow against the cabin in long, dry sighs. The sound resembles waves against a ship hull. After enough storms, settlers probably stopped hearing it consciously. Human beings possess a remarkable ability to normalize almost anything, including sleeping inside wooden boxes while nature attempts to refrigerate the continent around them. The father reaches beneath the bench and pulls out a small sack. Flour, not much. He loosens the tie and checks the contents silently before closing it again. That single motion tells you everything about frontier winter psychology. Constant calculation. How many days left? How much wood remaining? Whether roads might reopen before supplies run low. Some historians have questioned whether frontier communities exaggerated stories of winter hardship later in life, or whether memory actually softened the experience over time. Survivors often describe terrible storms calmly decades afterward, almost affectionately. Perhaps distance turns suffering into nostalgia once survival becomes certain. At the moment, though, nothing here feels nostalgic, only practical. The mother pours weak tea into tin cups. No sugar tonight. Sugar remained expensive on many frontiers, especially during harsh winters when transport routes closed. Coffee, too. Some settlers brewed substitutes from roasted grains or roots instead. Imagine waking before dawn to milk cows in freezing wind while drinking hot beet water pretending to be coffee. Human resilience deserves admiration, but it also deserves better beverages. The children shift closer together beneath blankets. One leans sleepily against the dog, who accepts this responsibility with the weary dignity of an underpaid guardian. Animals often became emotional anchors during frontier winters. Dogs warned families about strangers, storms, predators, and occasionally absolutely nothing at all at 3 a.m. The cabin ceiling disappears into smoke-darkened shadows overhead. Ventilation remained difficult in winter. Open the cabin too much and warmth escaped. seal it too tightly and smoke lingered inside. Many frontier families lived with constant eye irritation and coughing from indoor fires. Walls absorbed years of soot until entire interiors darkened permanently. A curious frontier tidbit survives in several diary accounts describing people placing onions around sick beds because they believed onions absorbed illness from the air. Frontier medicine mixed practical knowledge with hopeful improvisation in fascinating ways. To be fair, when the nearest doctor lives 2 blizzards away, the onion begins looking surprisingly qualified. You finish the last of the stew slowly. Heat settles pleasantly in your stomach. For a moment, despite the storm outside, the cabin feels secure, small but protected. Human beings gathered around firelight while winter pressed against the walls, thousands of years before frontier America existed. The scene carries something ancient beneath its ordinary details. The father reaches for a fiddle resting near the shelf. Only 3 strings remain intact. Still, he plays quietly. The melody wavers at first, rough from cold, stiff fingers, but gradually steadies into something soft and familiar. The children relax almost immediately. Music mattered deeply in isolated communities. Songs carried memory, comfort, religion, humour, and reminders of places left behind. You listen while firelight flickers across the room. The mother mends clothing beside the hearth using careful movements practiced countless times before. Needles flash silver briefly in the glow. Every garment required maintenance during winter, because replacing clothing on the frontier cost time and money many families lacked. Scholars still debate how much emotional strain constant labour placed upon frontier women in particular, whose responsibilities rarely paused even during illness or dangerous weather. Diaries often describe endless domestic work performed beside crying children, failing fires and severe cold. Yet many accounts also describe pride, competence, the satisfaction of keeping a household alive through conditions that might overwhelm unprepared newcomers. The fiddle music slows. Outside, snow taps softly against the shutter. You notice now that nobody here speaks about winter ending soon. Frontier families learned not to trust optimism too early. Storms returned unexpectedly. Spring blizzards killed people who relaxed too soon. Survival required patience more than confidence. The fire settles lower. Orange coals pulse gently beneath collapsing wood. The mother adds another log after studying the pile beside the hearth first. Always measuring, always counting. Even fire itself becomes mathematics during frontier winters. One child finally falls asleep sitting upright beneath the blanket. The father lowers the fiddle quietly. Nobody laughs loudly. Nobody wastes motion. The cabin drifts gradually towards silence except for the wind, the fire, and the soft breathing of tired people who understand tomorrow will demand the same routines all over again. And somewhere beyond the frosted window, snow continues falling across the dark prairie without hurry, without anger, and without end. The fiddle has gone quiet now, and the cabin settles into the softer sounds of the night. Firewood shifts with faint cracking noises. Wind slides along the outer walls in slow, icy fingers. Somewhere beneath the floorboards, you hear the tiny scratching of mice conducting what appears to be an organized campaign against the household grain supply. The children grow sleepier by the minute. One small boy already lies curled beneath quilts near the hearth, cheeks pink from heat and exhaustion. Another child rubs tired eyes while fighting sleep with the seriousness of someone resisting a diplomatic surrender. Frontier children often worked hard from very young ages, yet winter nights could reduce even the most determined little pioneer into a blanket-wrapped heap beside the fire. The mother kneels beside them. You notice how many layers the children wear even indoors. Wool shirts beneath heavier garments. Thick socks. Caps pulled low over ears. At first it seems excessive until a cold draft slips across the cabin floor and curls around your boots like invisible water. Warm air rises. Cold air waits below. The lower half of the cabin remains chilly despite the fire. A well-documented truth from frontier history is that families frequently shared beds during winter purely for survival. Body heat mattered. Parents, children, grandparents, and sometimes visiting travellers slept packed closely together beneath quilts stuffed with feathers, wool, or scraps of fabric. Privacy belonged mostly to wealthier centuries. The mother lifts a sleeping baby from a cradle near the wall. The cradle itself hangs slightly above floor level because the coldest air settles low during the night. Even tiny adjustments could matter in severe weather. Frontier parents became constant observers of temperature. They checked fingers, noses, breathing, blankets, and embers repeatedly through the darkness. You watch the baby stir softly. For a moment the cabin feels impossibly fragile. Outside stretches miles of frozen prairie where temperatures can plunge far below zero. Inside, one weak fire protects this entire family from the cold. The balance feels almost absurd when you think about it too long. Civilization reduced to a few glowing coals and several determined adults refusing to panic. The father spreads extra blankets across the bedding area. None match. Some appear patched dozens of times. Others look pieced together from old coats or flour sacks. Textile scarcity shaped frontier life more than many people realize. Cloth cost money. Warm cloth cost even more. Families repaired garments endlessly because replacement often remained impossible until spring trade routes reopened. An unusual detail appears in several frontier accounts describing mothers warming stones near the fire before wrapping them in cloth and placing them at the foot of children's beds. Primitive heating technology, perhaps, but surprisingly effective. Also a wonderful way to discover whether your blanket now contains a rock still slightly hotter than the surface of the sun. The dog rises reluctantly and circles twice before collapsing beside the sleeping children again. A guardian returning to duty. You notice how carefully the mother arranges everyone beneath the quilts. Smaller children toward the centre, extra layers near the outer edges. The cabin itself behaves almost like a living organism, adapting to survive winter night after night. Outside, the storm strengthens. Snow brushes harder against the roof now. The sound resembles handfuls of sand thrown steadily across wood. Occasionally the wind changes direction and pushes smoke briefly back down the chimney, filling the room with a bitter scent that stings your throat. The father opens the flue slightly. Immediately cold air spills inward too. Frontier life involved endless compromise. Too much ventilation and everyone freezes. Too little and the room fills with smoke or dangerous fumes. Modern heating systems spoil people magnificently. You press a button today and complain if the room reaches the wrong temperature by 2 degrees. Frontier families would have celebrated wildly over reliable insulation and a thermostat. Researchers remain divided on how often frontier parents intentionally downplayed danger around children to preserve calm during storms. Many memoirs written later in life describe adults speaking gently and behaving normally even while supplies ran low or blizzard conditions worsened outside. You suspect that performance happens here too. The mother smiles softly while adjusting blankets. The father speaks casually about tomorrow's chores, but both glance toward the door whenever the wind slams harder against the cabin walls. The baby begins fussing quietly. Immediately the mother lifts the child closer to her chest beneath a shawl. Shared warmth again, shared breath, shared survival. Human history contains endless grand wars and famous rulers, yet so much of actual survival comes down to ordinary people holding children close beside weak fires. You sit quietly listening to the cabin breathe. Because it does breathe. Timbers expand near the heat and contract beside the cold outer walls. Cracks whisper softly. Roof beams settle. The chimney hums faintly whenever gusts pass overhead. After enough winters, families learn to recognize familiar sounds the way sailors recognize ocean weather. One child mutters in sleep, another coughs once before settling again. The mother reaches automatically to feel the child's forehead. Even healthy children faced enormous risks during frontier winters. Illness spread easily in cramped cabins where ventilation remained poor and medical care distant. Diseases that modern antibiotics treat casually could become terrifying. Parents watched fevers constantly because weather often prevented any possibility of outside help. A lesser-known frontier custom involved hanging thick curtains or quilts around sleeping areas to trap heat more effectively overnight. The result created tiny fabric rooms inside already tiny cabins. Cozy perhaps, though probably carrying the atmosphere of sleeping inside an overheated laundry basket. The fire sinks lower. Orange embers pulse beneath blackening logs. The father adds only a small piece of wood this time. Careful rationing again. Families could not afford to burn through fuel too quickly before the season ended. Some winters lasted brutally long across the northern plains, with snow remaining into late spring. You hear wolves somewhere far outside, very faint, almost lost beneath the wind. The sound changes the room subtly. Nobody panics. Wolves rarely attacked cabins directly. Still, frontier nights reminded families constantly that nature remained close beyond those walls. Predators, storms, disease, freezing temperatures. Civilization sat thinly across the wilderness like frost across glass. The mother finally lies down beside the children. The father stays awake a little longer near the hearth, watching the coals carefully. Many adults slept lightly during blizzard season, waking often to feed fires or check drifting snow against the doors. His shadow flickers across the walls, tired, silent, steady, and gradually, as snow continues gathering outside the cabin under the endless dark prairie sky, the family drifts into uneasy sleep together beneath layers of patched quilts and borrowed warmth. The night passes in fragments. Wind, firelight, creaking beams, a child coughing softly somewhere beneath the heavy blankets. Then eventually, long before sunrise, the father rises from the bedding with the slow stiffness of a man whose bones have negotiated unsuccessfully with winter for many years already. The cabin remains dark except for dim red coals glowing inside the hearth. Frost has spread farther across the windows overnight, tracing pale white patterns like frozen fern leaves. The air feels colder now. Fires weaken quickly while people sleep. You hear the father pulling on boots near the door. Leather creaks. Metal buckles click softly. The dog lifts its head immediately, because frontier dogs somehow always knew when outdoor chores approached and reacted with the emotional enthusiasm of office workers hearing the phrase, mandatory weekend meeting. The mother wakes too, though she barely opens her eyes. Wind eased some, the father whispers. She nods faintly before pulling the blankets tighter around the children. Nobody says the obvious thing aloud. The animals still need feeding. Water still needs breaking through ice. Storm or not, livestock survival remains tied directly to human survival. A dead horse or starving cow could destroy a family financially as surely as fire or disease. The father opens the cabin door. Cold air crashes inward instantly. Not cool air, not fresh air. Real frontier cold, sharp enough to sting your lungs before you even step outside. The kind of cold that makes exposed skin feel brittle within moments. Snow swirls across the doorway in pale ribbons before the door slams shut again behind you. Darkness still blankets the settlement. Only a few chimneys smoke weakly beneath the fading storm clouds. Snowdrifts reach halfway up fences now. The world appears reshaped overnight, smoother and quieter, as though winter erased unnecessary details while everyone slept. You follow the father toward the animal shed. Each step sinks deep. Snow squeaks beneath your boots with that strange dry sound created only by extreme cold. Frontier diaries often mention how winter changed ordinary noises. Wood snapped louder, breath seemed sharper, even silence carried weight. A widely accepted historical observation notes that livestock care consumed enormous energy during frontier winters. Horses, cows, chickens, and pigs required constant attention despite dangerous weather. Families depended on these animals for food, transportation, labour, milk, eggs, and income. Losing them during storms could mean starvation later. The father pauses beside a drift nearly chest-high. You stare at it in disbelief. During severe prairie blizzards, snow sometimes buried entire barns and fences completely from view. Travellers became disoriented in familiar areas because landmarks vanished beneath white hills sculpted by wind. Some families tied ropes between house and barn to avoid becoming lost only yards from safety. Honestly, if modern people complain about scraping ice from car windows, frontier settlers would probably stare at us the way exhausted teachers stare at children eating glue. The dog bounds ahead enthusiastically and immediately disappears nose first into a drift. Very helpful. The father reaches the shed door and shoulders it open against packed snow. Warm animal breath rolls outward into the cold air, carrying heavy earthy smells of hay, manure, damp fur, and survival. Inside stands the horse, alive, barely interested in your emotional relief. Admittedly, but alive. The cow shifts heavily nearby while frost clings to the wooden beams overhead. Chickens murmur softly from a corner coop insulated with burlap sacks and straw. Frontier families often brought smaller animals astonishingly close to living quarters during severe weather because warmth mattered more than elegance. The father checks feed carefully. Not much left. Hay supplies determined whether livestock survived winter in many frontier regions. Farmers spent warmer months cutting and storing enormous quantities because snow covered grazing land for long periods. A hard winter could wipe out herds across entire territories. The horse nudges the father's shoulder impatiently. You notice affection hidden beneath routine motions now. Frontier families relied deeply on working animals. Horses especially became companions as much as tools. People spoke to them constantly during long, isolated winters, sometimes probably more reasonably than they spoke to neighbours. The father breaks ice inside the water trough using an axe head. Sharp cracks echo through the shed. Ice removal became a daily frontier chore once temperatures plunged low enough. Water froze indoors sometimes too. Imagine waking before dawn specifically to fight frozen buckets with hand tools while your eyelashes freeze together. Suddenly your annoying morning alarm feels surprisingly luxurious. Snow drifts through gaps in the shed walls. Nothing here is perfectly sealed. Frontier structures aged hard beneath constant exposure to storms, moisture, insects, and freezing temperatures. Maintenance never truly ended. Researchers still examine how much winter livestock losses contributed to frontier migration patterns, especially across harsher northern territories where repeated bad seasons financially ruined many settlers. Survival depended not only on human endurance, but also on keeping animals alive through impossible weather. The father tosses extra hay toward the cow, not generously, measured carefully again. Everything during winter becomes calculation. Food for animals, food for people, firewood remaining, distance to spring. One curious frontier practice involved wrapping horse legs in strips of old blanket or burlap during extreme cold to protect against frost damage. Horses working through blizzards suffered terribly in harsh winters, though frontier families often depended too heavily on them to allow much rest. Outside, dawn slowly begins touching the horizon. Grey light spreads across the snowfields beyond the settlement. Wind still moves drifting powder across the ground in thin ghost-like streams. The storm has weakened, but not vanished. Frontier weather preferred lingering dramatically near the stage exit. The father steps back outdoors carrying a bucket. Your face burns from the cold immediately again. Smoke rises from several cabins now as families wake across the settlement. Somewhere nearby, an axe begins chopping wood with slow rhythmic strikes. Another day starting. Another round of chores before full daylight even arrives. You glance toward the cabin behind you. Tiny, fragile. Yet inside waits warmth, sleeping children, weak tea, patched quilts, and people stubborn enough to keep surviving another winter morning. The father pauses halfway back through the snow and studies the sky carefully. Clouds still hang thick to the north. More weather coming, perhaps. He says nothing, but you notice the way his shoulders tighten slightly beneath the coat. Frontier families learned caution from experience. Storms often returned before roads reopened or supplies recovered. The dog shakes snow wildly across both of you before trotting proudly ahead toward the cabin, as though personally responsible for preserving civilization itself. And perhaps, in some small frozen way, it is behind you. The animals settle quietly inside the dim shed while another cold frontier dawn rises slowly over the endless white prairie. The cabin door closes behind you, and warmth returns in slow layers rather than all at once. Your cheeks sting as feeling creeps painfully back into them. Snow melts from the father's boots onto the rough plank floor while the dog immediately claims the best place beside the hearth, with the smooth confidence of a creature who has contributed moral support and considers the matter settled. Inside, the cabin is already awake. Or rather, the mother has been awake long enough to make it seem that way. The fire burns brighter now. A fresh kettle simmers above the flames. Damp clothes have been rearranged carefully to dry without scorching. One child still sleeps beneath quilts, while another rubs sleepy eyes beside the table, hair sticking upward in impossible directions. Frontier mornings were rarely graceful. People today post photographs of rustic cabin life with steaming mugs and tidy blankets. Real winter mornings looked more like exhausted humans negotiating peace treaties with frozen socks. The mother moves steadily through the room. You notice there is almost no wasted motion. She checks the bread, feeds the fire, wraps a scarf around the youngest child, sweeps melting snow away from the doorway before it refreezes into dangerous ice. Every task seems small by itself. Together they form the structure holding the household together. Many historians point out that women's labour on the frontier often determined whether families survived difficult winters. Men handled outdoor work and livestock care, certainly, but women managed food preservation, clothing repair, water heating, childcare, illness treatment, cooking, laundry, and the endless maintenance required inside cramped cabins. And unlike dramatic blizzard scenes in movies, this work did not happen once. It happened every single day. You smell cornmeal warming near the hearth. Breakfast today appears simple. Corn mush thickened with milk if the cow still produces enough. Perhaps a little molasses if supplies allow it. Frontier diets varied by region, wealth, and luck. But winter meals often became repetitive quickly. Families learned to appreciate familiarity because surprises in winter usually arrived carrying unpleasant consequences. The mother hands the father a tin cup of hot coffee substitute. Roasted barley, perhaps. He drinks it gratefully anyway. One forgotten frontier recipe involved brewing beverages from burnt bread crusts during shortages, which sounds less like coffee and more like culinary revenge against optimism itself. The younger child finally wakes fully and begins crying softly from the cold. Immediately the mother lifts the child onto her lap near the fire. You notice how often frontier mothers physically carried children close during winter months. Shared warmth again, shared breath, shared reassurance. Cabins lost heat rapidly overnight, and small children struggled, especially in freezing temperatures. Outside, wind rattles the shutter briefly. Everyone glances toward the sound without thinking. That reflex tells you something important. Frontier families never entirely relax during winter storms. Even inside, part of the mind remained listening constantly for danger. Roof strain, chimney problems, sudden silence from livestock outside. Wind changes. The father removes ice from his beard with rough fingers. The mother notices immediately and sets warm water near him without comment. Tiny acts of care pass constantly between them, quiet as snowfall. A recognized historical reality is that frontier women frequently rose before the rest of the household during winter to restart fires that had weakened overnight. Keeping embers alive mattered enormously, because creating a fresh fire from scratch in freezing conditions consumed precious time and fuel. You glance toward the hearth now. Beneath the dancing flames sits a careful arrangement of coals banked closely together. The fire was protected through the night rather than allowed to die completely. Experienced households understood fire almost like a living companion needing constant attention. The older child begins pulling on stiff boots reluctantly. School during winter depended entirely on weather. Some communities maintained tiny schoolhouses despite dangerous conditions, while others suspended lessons after major storms. The famous schoolhouse blizzard of 1888 changed attitudes toward winter weather dramatically after children and teachers died trying to return home through sudden whiteout conditions. Since then, generations of children everywhere have inherited the sacred tradition of staring hopefully out windows, wishing snow might cancel responsibilities. The mother opens a small wooden box near the shelf. Inside sits sewing thread, buttons, scraps of cloth, and precious needles. She repairs a torn mitten while balancing the younger child against one hip. The rhythm feels practiced beyond thought. Researchers continue discussing how frontier women preserved emotional resilience during long winters, marked by isolation and relentless domestic labour. Diaries from the period reveal exhaustion certainly, but also humour, creativity, and fierce pride in maintaining households under harsh conditions. You can see traces of that pride here. The cabin may be cramped, the food may be plain, but everything possible has been done to keep this family alive. A peculiar little detail appears in some frontier memoirs describing women heating flat irons beside the fire and briefly placing them beneath blankets before bedtime to warm the sheets. Primitive comfort technology, perhaps, though one imagines occasional accidents involving overheated bedding and very surprised sleepers. The mother begins kneading dough now, her sleeves rolled slightly, hands moving steadily through flour and water while the cabin fills with soft scraping sounds. Bread carried enormous symbolic importance on the frontier, fresh bread especially. Even modest loaves transformed morale during difficult winters. The father gathers tools near the doorway again. More outdoor work waiting already. Snow still needs clearing away from the shed entrance before drifting hardens. Water must be hauled, wood chopped. Frontier chores reproduce themselves overnight like particularly aggressive rabbits. The younger child laughs suddenly as the dog sneezes beside the fire. For the first time this morning, the room feels lighter. That matters too. Winter survival depended partly on morale. Endless darkness and isolation wore people down emotionally. Families created routines, songs, games, stories, and celebrations not merely for entertainment, but for psychological endurance. You notice sunlight finally touching the frost-covered windows. Weak pale gold filtering through ice patterns, beautiful in a distant sort of way. Cold beauty. The mother pauses briefly beside the hearth, rubbing tired hands together near the warmth. Just for a moment she stands still while steam curls softly from the kettle and snow whispers against the cabin walls. Then she resumes working immediately, because frontier winter does not care whether people feel rested. It only cares whether they continue, and inside this small smoke-darkened cabin, they do. Morning stretches slowly across the prairie. Pale and cold beneath thick winter clouds, the storm has weakened for now, but nobody inside the cabin behaves carelessly. Frontier families learned early that weather possessed a personality rather like an offended cat. Quiet one moment, violent the next, impossible to reason with either way. The father stands outside beside the woodpile studying the sky. You join him carefully through knee-deep snow while smoke drifts upward from the chimney behind you in thin blue ribbons. The air smells cleaner now after the heavy snowfall. Sharp pine, ice, wood smoke. Somewhere far off, livestock carry faint earthy scents across the frozen fields. The father narrows his eyes toward the horizon. Clouds gather low in the north again. Not dramatic clouds, No towering thunderheads, just a flat grey wall slowly thickening across the distance. That alone is enough to concern him. Before modern forecasting, frontier settlers depended heavily on observation, wind direction, cloud movement, animal behaviour. Even strange silences in the landscape became warning signs. Survival often meant recognizing storms before they fully arrived. You noticed the birds first, or rather the absence of them. Yesterday a few crows circled near the settlement. Today the sky remains empty except for drifting snow crystals glittering faintly in the weak sunlight. The father notices too. Too quiet, he mutters softly. A historically supported detail from frontier records shows that experienced settlers paid close attention to sudden weather changes, especially rapid temperature drops accompanied by shifting winds. Prairie blizzards could develop astonishingly fast. Warm mornings sometimes transformed into lethal storms by afternoon. The dog sniffs the air suspiciously beside you, then immediately becomes distracted by a buried stick. Nature's great detective defeated once again by enthusiasm. The father walks toward the edge of the settlement where fences disappear beneath drifts. Snow squeaks sharply beneath every step. Even the texture feels different now. Drier, finer. Loose powder moving easily across the ground. You realize frontier weather demanded constant interpretation. The landscape itself became a language families learned to read over time. A certain shape of cloud, a certain smell in the wind, frost forming unusually thick along windows at dawn. The father bends briefly near the snow. You look closer. Rabbit tracks, fresh. Yet they angle sharply toward thicker brush instead of crossing open ground. Animals often sensed approaching storms earlier than humans did. Horses became restless. Birds vanished. Livestock turned away from incoming winds. Some frontier families trusted animal behavior almost as much as the sky itself. One unusual frontier belief claimed that aching joints predicted storms better than barometers. To be fair, after years of hauling firewood and sleeping beside drafty walls, nearly everybody probably ached constantly, meaning winter forecasts may have sounded impressively dramatic at all times. Back at the cabin, the mother has already begun preparing for worsening weather without waiting for confirmation. Extra water buckets line the wall. More wood rests beside the hearth. Wet clothing has been brought fully indoors to prevent freezing stiff outside. Preparation begins before certainty. That mattered enormously on the frontier. A delayed decision during winter could become fatal very quickly. The older child helps stack wood now, arms wrapped around several uneven logs while trying very hard to appear responsible. The effort is admirable. The result resembles a determined squirrel transporting objects much larger than itself. Inside, the cabin grows warmer from increased activity. The mother kneads dough again while occasionally glancing toward the windows. You notice everybody listening to the weather even during ordinary chores. Silence outdoors feels different now, heavier somehow. Several academic studies examining frontier diaries suggest settlers developed intense environmental awareness simply because survival required it. Modern people spend much of life indoors separated from weather by insulation, vehicles, and forecasts. Frontier families experienced every temperature shift directly through walls, skin, smoke patterns, and changing sounds. You hear it before seeing it. Wind. Faint at first, a low steady murmur crossing the open prairie. The father pauses immediately near the doorway. So does the mother. Nobody speaks for several seconds. Then life resumes again, only faster. More wood indoors. Animals checked again. Snow shoveled away from the entrance before drifting worsens. Children instructed firmly not to wander beyond sight of the cabin. The rhythm changes, calm but urgent. A fascinating little historical oddity survives from some northern frontier communities where people hung strips of dried fish or animal bones outdoors specifically to study wind direction and ice build-up before storms. Primitive weather stations, perhaps, though considerably smellier than modern technology. You step outside once more. The sky has darkened noticeably already. Clouds slide low across the prairie with unsettling speed. Snow begins moving differently too, lifting from the ground in pale streaks that twist across open spaces like spirits searching for somewhere warm. The father studies the western horizon carefully. "Bad one coming," he says quietly. Not dramatic, not fearful, just certain. That certainty feels heavier somehow. A horse whinnies nervously from the shed. The dog no longer plays. Even the chickens inside the coop have grown strangely quiet. Nature holds its breath before storm sometimes. Frontier families recognize that silence instinctively. The world seems to pause just before weather turns violent. The mother calls everyone indoors. The cabin door shuts firmly behind you. Inside, warmth and smoke wrap around the family again, while outside the first real gust strikes the walls hard enough to rattle the shutters. Fine snow slips through tiny cracks near the floorboards immediately. The younger child startles at the sound. The mother rests one hand gently against the child's shoulder. "It's all right," she whispers. Perhaps she believes it, perhaps not fully. Scholars examining frontier settlement patterns continue discussing whether repeated exposure to extreme weather gradually reduced fear or merely taught people how to function alongside it. Courage and routine often look remarkably similar from a distance. The father secures extra fabric against the lower door frame. The mother hangs heavier blankets near the sleeping area to trap warmth. The older child carries another armful of wood toward the hearth proudly, nearly disappearing behind the pile. Outside, wind rises steadily now. Snow brushes harder against the cabin roof. Light fades early beneath thickening clouds until afternoon already resembles evening. The settlement beyond the frosted windows slowly disappears into pale glowing white. Another storm arriving, another long night approaching, and inside this small cabin, every person moves quietly through familiar preparations while the frontier wilderness gathers its strength outside once again. The storm arrives fully before sunset, not with a single dramatic moment, but gradually, patiently, as though winter simply decides it has waited long enough and now intends to reclaim the land outside the cabin walls. Wind presses harder against the settlement. Snow thickens. The world beyond the windows fades from grey to white, and then from white to almost nothing at all. Cabins disappear one by one behind swirling curtains of drifting snow, until your entire universe narrows to this single room, glowing dimly around the hearth. The sound changes first. Earlier, the wind merely whispered across the roof. Now it growls steadily through every crack and seam in the cabin. Snow rattles against the shutters like thrown handfuls of dry grain. Occasionally, a stronger gust strikes the walls hard enough to shake loose tiny sprinkles of frost from the rafters overhead. The younger child startles each time. The mother keeps one arm wrapped gently around the child's shoulders while stirring a pot near the fire. The father checks the door again, then the chimney, then the roof beams with quick practiced glances. A firmly documented reality of frontier blizzards is that many storms produce complete whiteout conditions, where travellers lost all sense of direction within minutes. Even experienced settlers sometimes became disoriented only steps from safety. Snow erased roads, fences, hills, and landmarks until sky and ground merged together. You imagine stepping outside now. Instant blindness, instant cold. The thought alone makes the cabin feel smaller, and somehow safer too. The dog paces near the doorway uneasily before finally retreating beside the children. Animals often sensed the violence of storms long before humans fully understood what was coming. Horses became agitated. Chickens crowded tightly together. Dogs whined at sudden pressure changes or strange sounds carried by the wind. One frontier tale from the northern plains describes a farmer finding his cows standing frozen in place after a blizzard, packed so tightly together for warmth that snow drifted around them like stone monuments. The image feels almost unreal until you hear the storm outside and understand how quickly winter transformed living creatures into desperate survivors. The mother lowers the fire slightly after cooking. Not because the room feels warm enough, because wood must last. That calculation never disappears. The father stacks more logs nearby anyway, preparing for a long night ahead. He moves with the tense focus of someone who has survived storms before and remembers exactly how bad they can become. You notice the windows no longer show light from neighbouring cabins. Only white movement. The settlement beyond these walls has vanished entirely. Some modern historians have explored whether frontier settlers experience blizzards almost like psychological isolation chambers. Families trapped indoors for days described strange sensations in diaries afterward. Distorted time, heightened anxiety. Relief so intense at hearing another human voice that people wept openly when storms finally passed. Inside the cabin, the air grows warmer but heavier. Smoke curls slowly upward toward the ceiling beams. Wet wool dries beside the hearth. Boots line the wall near the door. The smell of soup still lingers faintly beneath sharper scents of firewood and damp leather. The older child helps fold blankets near the bedding area. The younger one sits very still, listening to the wind. Nobody speaks loudly now. The storm seems to discourage unnecessary noise. A curious detail from frontier memoirs mentions some children believing blizzards contained spirits or voices because the wind produced eerie sounds around cabin corners and chimneys. Honestly, after hearing these gusts howl through freezing darkness, you can understand why imagination became unusually active during winter nights. Outside, something bangs suddenly against the outer wall. Everyone freezes. The father grabs his lantern immediately. Another impact follows. Then silence. You realize your own breathing has stopped. The father waits several seconds before opening the door only a crack. Snow blasts inward instantly, spinning across the floorboards in pale, furious clouds. The lantern light reveals almost nothing beyond the threshold except violent white motion. A loose board from the woodpile. Nothing more. He drags it inside quickly and slams the door shut again against the wind. The younger child begins crying softly from fright. The mother pulls the child close beneath a quilt while speaking in low, calm tones. Frontier parents became experts at controlled reactions. Panic spread quickly inside small spaces during storms. Adults often performed confidence for the sake of children, even when fear pressed heavily against them too. Researchers continue debating how many frontier survival stories were later softened by memory and storytelling traditions. Real storms often involved exhaustion, terror, hunger, and dangerous cold rather than the rugged adventure later celebrated in novels and paintings. Right now, there is nothing romantic about this. The cabin trembles again beneath another gust. Snow slips through cracks near the roofline and melts slowly against the warm interior beams. The father stuffs extra cloth into the worst gaps while muttering quietly under his breath. The mother serves another round of hot broth. Thin, mostly water and flavour. Still, everyone cups the bowls gratefully between cold hands. Warm food during storms offered comfort beyond nutrition. Heat spreading through the body reassured people they were still safe, still sheltered, still surviving. The dog lifts its head suddenly toward the chimney. A strange low whistle hums down through the flue as wind changes direction overhead. The sound almost resembles distant singing. No wonder children imagine spirits. You sit close to the fire now, close enough to feel heat prickling your skin while cold drafts still brush faintly across your boots. That contrast defines frontier winter life more than anything else. Warmth and cold existing together constantly. Safety and danger separated only by timber walls and burning wood. Outside, darkness settles completely. The storm grows louder. Snow piles against the cabin in steady layers. Drifts rise along the walls. Somewhere beyond visibility, other families sit beside other fires, listening to the same wind move across the prairie. The father finally lowers himself onto the bench near the hearth. Tired, silent, watching the flames carefully. The mother rocks the sleepy child gently beneath patched blankets, while shadows flicker across the smoke-stained walls. And beyond the tiny frosted windows, the blizzard continues, swallowing the frontier one cabin at a time beneath the endless frozen night. The storm continues through the night without mercy or interruption. Wind pounds the cabin walls in heavy bursts now, shaking the shutters hard enough to make frost drift from the ceiling beams like pale dust. Outside, no horizon exists anymore. No road, no neighbouring cabins, only spinning white darkness moving endlessly across the prairie. Inside, the fire becomes the centre of everything. Not symbolically, literally, every person in the cabin watches it constantly, whether consciously or not. The flames determine comfort, safety, drying clothes, warm food, and survival itself. Once frontier storms trapped families indoors, the hearth became less a household feature and more a living heartbeat. The father kneels beside it again. The flames look weaker now, not dead yet, but struggling. The wood stacked nearby contains more moisture than he would like. You hear it immediately when he places another log onto the embers, a dull hiss instead of a clean crackle. Damp wood burns reluctantly, producing more smoke than heat. The cabin grows colder almost at once. The younger child whimpers softly beneath the blankets. A firmly established fact from frontier life is that maintaining reliable heat during winter storms remained one of the greatest daily challenges settlers faced. Poorly seasoned wood, damaged chimneys, heavy snow-blocking ventilation, or dwindling fuel supplies could turn cabins dangerously cold within hours. The father leans closer to the hearth. He adjusts the logs carefully using an iron poker blackened by years of use. Sparks rise briefly, glowing orange before disappearing into shadow overhead. Smoke curls sideways instead of upward for a moment, making everyone cough. The mother opens the flue slightly. Cold air slips inward immediately. Again that impossible frontier balance. Too much air and the fire weakens. Too little and smoke fills the room. Winter survival often resembled solving difficult problems while exhausted and freezing. One little-known frontier trick involved drying damp firewood near the hearth rafters before burning it fully. Cabins frequently displayed hanging rows of partially drying wood overhead, creating interiors that smelled permanently of smoke, sap, and wet bark. You notice several logs already stacked close beside the fire. The father planned ahead. Even so, concern lines his face now. Outside, another violent gust slams against the roof. The chimney hums low and strangely. For a second, smoke blows back into the cabin entirely, filling the room with a bitter, choking haze. The older child pulls a blanket over her nose and mouth instinctively. The dog sneezes dramatically beside the wall, offended by both weather and air quality. To be fair, frontier cabins would absolutely fail every modern ventilation inspection within minutes. The mother wipes moisture from the inside of the window using her sleeve. Condensation freezes rapidly around the edges again. Ice creeps inward slowly across the glass like spreading crystal vines. The room feels dimmer now despite the firelight because smoke lingers beneath the rafters. Several researchers examining frontier architecture have noted how difficult it was for many families to construct truly efficient heating systems with limited materials and experience. New settlers especially struggled. Cabins built quickly before winter often leaked heat terribly through roofs, floors, and poorly fitted chimneys. The father adds another log, still damp, still reluctant. Flames flicker lower again. Silence settles across the room except for the storm and the weak crackling of the fire. You sense the emotional shift immediately. A strong fire comforts people. A failing one changes the entire atmosphere. The mother begins gathering extra blankets without comment. Practical. Prepared. The younger child has already fallen asleep against her shoulder, cheeks flushed softly by the remaining heat. The older child stares at the flames with the intense focus children often reserve for situations adults clearly consider serious. A strange frontier anecdote survives from winter diaries describing settlers occasionally heating bricks inside hearth ashes and wrapping them in cloth to carry around cabins like portable warmth. Primitive central heating, perhaps. Though one imagines accidental foot burns became an exciting seasonal tradition. The father finally stands and pulls on his coat again. You stare at him. Surely not outside. But yes, outside. More wood must come in. The storm has worsened too much to wait until morning. He wraps a scarf tightly across his face before opening the door. Instantly, wind screams through the cabin entrance, carrying snow in furious spirals across the floorboards. The lantern flame nearly dies. Then he disappears into the white darkness. The door slams shut behind him. For several seconds, nobody moves. You hear almost nothing beyond the storm itself. The mother watches the door silently while keeping one hand against the sleeping child's back. Her expression remains calm, though tension tightens around her eyes now. Time stretches strangely during storms. Minutes feel longer. The fire shrinks further while everyone waits. Then finally, a heavy thud against the door. The father returns carrying an armful of wood covered in blowing snow. Ice crystals cling thickly across his beard and eyebrows. He stamps snow from his boots while breathing hard from the cold. The dog circles excitedly as though personally responsible for the successful lumber expedition. The father laughs softly despite exhaustion. That laugh matters more than you expect. People needed moments like that during frontier winters. Tiny releases of fear. Tiny reminders that the storm had not swallowed them yet. He feeds the driest pieces into the fire carefully. This time the flames catch stronger. Warm orange light spreads gradually across the room again. The younger child stirs beneath the blankets. The mother finally exhales slowly, tension easing from her shoulders. A number of historians continue discussing how much emotional endurance contributed to frontier survival compared to purely physical preparation. Families who maintained routines, humour, and cooperation often endured isolation better than those overwhelmed by fear or hopelessness. The fire climbs higher now, not roaring, but alive again. You feel warmth returning slowly to your hands and feet. Wet gloves begin steaming near the hearth. Smoke thins slightly beneath the rafters. Outside, the blizzard still rages beyond the walls, relentless and immense. Yet inside this cramped cabin, several determined people sit close around renewed flames while the storm spends itself against timber and snow. And for tonight at least, the fire refuses to die. By morning, the storm still has not ended. The wind no longer screams constantly, but it continues moving across the cabin in long heavy gusts that make the walls groan softly. Snow presses high against the door now. When the father opens it briefly at dawn, pale light spills inward across a drift nearly reaching the handle. The world outside has disappeared beneath white silence. Inside the cabin, the fire survives.
Barely.
Everyone wakes slowly beneath layers of blankets and stale warmth. The air smells thicker this morning. Smoke, damp wool, human breath trapped overnight inside a single crowded room. Frontier winters carried many scents, but freshness rarely ranked among them. The mother stretches stiff shoulders before kneeling near the hearth. Breakfast preparations begin quietly. Not much remains. You notice it immediately in the way she handles supplies. Flour measured carefully. Beans counted almost unconsciously while pouring them into the pot. Even the children seem aware today that food has become serious. A well-documented feature of frontier winters was the constant anxiety surrounding supplies. Once storms blocked roads and trails, families depended entirely on whatever had already been stored before snowfall. Miscalculate badly enough, and hunger arrived long before spring. The father unties the flour sack again. Less than before, noticeably less. He says nothing, though silence itself carries meaning now. The older child asks for more bread anyway, because children throughout history have bravely continued the ancient tradition of requesting additional food during obvious shortages. The mother smiles gently but divides the portion smaller. Nobody complains afterward. Outside, snow hisses against the cabin walls in thin waves. The sound blends with the soft bubbling of weak bean soup over the fire. Hunger changes the atmosphere inside a room subtly. People move more slowly, speak less, watch cooking more carefully. One curious detail from frontier journals describes settlers making coffee substitutes from roasted acorns during difficult winters. Apparently the resulting drink tasted terrible but warm, which honestly describes many frontier survival meals rather accurately. You sit close to the hearth again, hands stretched toward fading warmth. The cabin feels colder today despite the fire. Storms lasting several days drained fuel supplies steadily, and nobody dares burn wood too quickly now. The mother slices salt pork into painfully thin pieces, transparent almost. Salted meat formed a major part of many winter diets because preservation mattered more than flavor or texture. Frontier food often prioritized survival first and enjoyment somewhere far lower on the list. Chewing through leathery strips of heavily salted pork while snow buries your barn outside probably builds character eventually. Or resentment. Possibly both. The younger child coughs again. The mother pauses instantly. You notice how quickly concern returns to her face every time. Illness and hunger together frightened frontier families deeply because weakened bodies struggled more against cold temperatures. Several scholars examining settlement diaries have observed that prolonged winter isolation often intensified emotional responses to food shortages. Even modest scarcity created enormous psychological pressure because families understood how limited their options truly were once storms trapped them indoors. The father pulls a small hidden jar from beneath a shelf. Molasses, a little. The children brighten immediately when the mother adds tiny amounts to their meal. Such a small luxury changes the mood of the entire cabin for several minutes. Sweetness becomes celebration when daily life revolves around survival. The dog watches breakfast with focused spiritual devotion. No creature in human history has ever believed more firmly in the possibility of receiving extra food than a frontier dog beside a cooking pot. The storm outside shifts again. Wind rises briefly before settling lower. Snow still falls, but finer now. Powder drifting endlessly across buried fences and vanished roads. The father studies the weather through the frosted window. He wants to check the animals again. You can tell. But conditions remain dangerous. Some frontier blizzards trapped families indoors completely for days at a time. Attempting travel during heavy drifting snow risked becoming lost almost immediately, especially across open prairie. A lesser-known frontier practice involved hanging strips of meat or sacks of grain inside cabins during severe storms to prevent supplies from freezing too solid outdoors. Unfortunately, this also invited mice into what was already an overcrowded living arrangement. The bean soup finally finishes cooking. Thin broth again, a few scraps of pork floating through it. Still, everyone eats carefully and gratefully. Hot food matters emotionally during long winters. Warmth entering the body provides reassurance difficult to describe unless you have stood shivering beside a weak fire while storms erase the world outside. The older child asks whether the storm will end soon. The father answers honestly. Eventually, not comforting perhaps, but true. Frontier parents often balanced reassurance with realism because children needed practical understanding of danger too. Storms lasted as long as storms wished to last. You notice the mother saving crumbs after the meal. Every crumb, she wraps leftover bread carefully inside cloth before placing it back near the shelf. Waste becomes almost offensive during hard winters. Families reused everything possible. Bones for broth, fabric scraps for patching, ashes for soap making. Even cooled bacon grease served multiple purposes. A number of historical researchers continue debating how accurately later frontier stories represented the reality of winter hunger. Many memoirs written decades afterwards softened difficult periods into tales of endurance and determination, while minimizing fear, weakness, or desperation. But sitting here now, listening to the storm while the family counts supplies quietly beside the fire, you understand how exhausting constant uncertainty must have felt. Not dramatic starvation, not sudden catastrophe, just the slow draining awareness that winter still has weeks remaining and the flour sack keeps growing lighter. The younger child falls asleep against the mother's shoulder after eating. The older child stares into the fire silently. The father sharpens a knife near the doorway more from habit than necessity. Steel scraping softly against stone while wind murmurs beyond the walls. And all across the buried frontier, other families sit beside other fires making the same calculations, stretching the same meals, and waiting for storms to loosen their grip on the frozen land outside. The storm finally weakens sometime during the second night. Not completely. Winter rarely surrenders with dignity. But by morning the wind has lowered from a furious roar to a steady, restless breathing across the snowfields. Light returns gradually through the frosted windows, pale and watery beneath thick clouds. The father stands at the doorway listening carefully before opening it. This time the door moves only after considerable effort because snow has drifted halfway across the entrance overnight. Cold air pours inward, carrying the sharp, clean smell that follows heavy storms. The world outside glows blinding white beneath fresh snow untouched by footprints. For several moments nobody speaks. The settlement looks transformed. Cabins appear smaller now, buried deep beneath curved drifts sculpted by wind. Fences have vanished entirely. The road between homes exists only as memory somewhere beneath the snow. The father exhales slowly, then begins digging. You join him outside where the cold strikes your face like icy water. Snow reaches above your knees immediately. Each movement feels slow and heavy. Frontier winters turned ordinary walking into labour. A broadly recognised aspect of frontier survival involved cooperation between neighbouring households after storms. Families checked on one another, shared supplies, dug paths through drifts, and helped recover buried livestock or damaged buildings. Isolation remained dangerous, but communities often survived precisely because neighbours refused to remain isolated for long. The father clears snow away from the doorway first, then toward the wood pile, then slowly toward the nearest neighbouring cabin, barely visible through drifting powder. The dog bounds ahead happily, thrilled that the outdoors once again contains recognisable shapes instead of pure airborne confusion. You hear other sounds emerging across the settlement too. Axes, shovels scraping wood, a distant voice calling through the cold air. Signs of life that matters deeply after storms. One strange frontier custom involved people firing guns into the air after severe blizzards simply to signal survival to nearby homesteads. Not ideal for peaceful mornings, perhaps, but effective. Nothing says good morning neighbour quite like celebratory gunfire echoing across frozen fields. The father reaches the neighbouring cabin eventually after exhausting work through waist-high drifts. Smoke rises from its chimney, though weakly. He knocks hard against the door. A moment later it opens. Warmth spills outward along with relieved voices. Inside lives an older couple wrapped in blankets near a tiny stove. The room smells strongly of onions, smoke, and damp wool. They survived the storm, though barely. The husband's hands tremble badly from cold as he accepts extra firewood carried over by the father. You realise frontier kindness often looked practical rather than emotional. Nobody delivers speeches. Nobody dramatically embraces. People simply share wood because freezing neighbours create unpleasant situations for everyone involved. The older woman insists on offering weak tea despite limited supplies. Hospitality survived even during hard winters. Human beings cling stubbornly to manners while civilization collapses around them. Quite impressive, honestly. Several historical accounts from prairie settlements describe communities forming informal survival networks during severe winters. Families borrowed flour, traded labour, shared livestock shelters, and sometimes combined households temporarily to conserve heat and resources. The older man points toward another cabin farther down the drifted road. No smoke. The father's expression tightens immediately. Without discussion, both men pull on heavier coats again. You follow them slowly through blowing snow. Every step sinks deep despite packed paths. The cold bites harder today because the wind still moves steadily across open spaces. Frost gathers quickly along scarves and eyebrows. The silent cabin waits half-buried beneath drifts. No chimney smoke, no visible movement. The father pounds hard against the door. Nothing. Then again. Finally, faint movement inside. The door cracks open slowly against packed snow. A woman appears holding a lantern, though daylight already fills the world outside as her eyes look exhausted. Two children sit bundled near a nearly dead fire behind her. Wood shortage. The father notices instantly. Without hesitation, he begins carrying logs from the sled dragged behind him. No speeches again, just action. One little-known detail from frontier records mentions that neighbours sometimes shared live coals between cabins after storms if fires died completely. Rekindling flames from surviving hearths carried symbolic importance too, almost like borrowing life itself from nearby households. Inside the struggling cabin, the air feels painfully cold. The children wear coats indoors. The mother apologizes repeatedly while trying to clear space near the hearth. Pride complicated frontier survival. Accepting help often embarrassed families already fighting to maintain independence under harsh conditions. The father ignores the apologies completely and rebuilds the fire. Soon flames rise stronger across the small stove while warmth slowly returns to the room. One child begins crying softly from relief or exhaustion, or perhaps both. Some scholars examining frontier culture continue discussing the tension between self-reliance myths and the actual dependence communities had upon one another during difficult seasons. Popular legends celebrate rugged independence, yet real survival frequently depended on cooperation. No family truly survived alone for long. Outside, sunlight finally breaks weakly through thinning clouds. The settlement sparkles beneath fresh snow almost beautifully now. Dangerous beauty. The kind that hides frozen livestock beneath drifts and nearly buried cabins beneath graceful curves of white. The father walks back home slowly beside you through the cleared path. Smoke rises from chimneys across the settlement once more. Voices drift faintly between cabins. Somebody laughs somewhere while shoveling snow from a roof. Life returning. The dog races ahead and disappears entirely into a drift, before emerging covered in snow with absolutely no lessons learned from the experience. Back inside the cabin, the mother has prepared fresh broth using the last soup bones. The room feels warmer than before, safer somehow, perhaps because neighbouring fires still burn beyond the storm. The older child peers through the window, watching figures move slowly between cabins, carrying wood, water, and supplies. The settlement survives because everyone keeps moving, keeps sharing, keeps checking whether smoke still rises from neighbouring roofs after the blizzard passes. And beyond the clustered cabins, the endless frontier stretches silent beneath deep snow, waiting patiently for the next storm already gathering somewhere far beyond the horizon. The storm leaves the settlement quieter afterward. Not peaceful exactly, more like exhausted. Snow lies deep across the prairie in smooth frozen waves reflecting pale winter sunlight. Smoke rises steadily from cabin chimneys again, though thinner now because wood supplies have grown precious. Everywhere you look, people move carefully through narrow shoveled paths between buildings carrying buckets, tools, and armfuls of fuel. Life resumes immediately because frontier winters never allowed long recovery. Inside the cabin, the father repairs a broken harness strap near the hearth, while the mother sorts remaining food stores beside the shelf. The children play quietly with carved wooden figures near the fire. Even their games seem softer after storms. You sit close enough to the hearth to feel warmth on your face while cold still lingers near the floorboards. That contrast has become familiar now. The father glances toward a pair of snowshoes hanging near the wall. "You know who taught settlers those," he says quietly. "You do know." Long before frontier homesteads spread across these territories, indigenous communities survived winters here for countless generations. They understood snow, weather patterns, animal migrations, insulation, clothing construction, and winter travel in ways newcomers often did not. A strongly supported historical understanding recognizes that many settlers adopted critical survival techniques from native peoples across North America: snowshoes, fur clothing methods, food preservation practices, shelter designs, and environmental knowledge frequently passed between cultures even during periods of conflict and displacement. Outside, the wind has settled into a low murmur moving across the drifts. The father lifts one of the snowshoes carefully. Light wooden frame, rawhide webbing stretched tightly across it, elegant in its practicality. Without snowshoes, deep winter travel across many northern regions became exhausting or impossible. Indigenous hunters and travellers perfected designs adapted to local terrain long before settlers arrived carrying unsuitable boots and dangerous confidence. The older child traces fingers curiously across the webbing. The father explains how snowshoes spread body weight across deep snow, simple physics keeping people alive. Frontier survival often depended less on conquering nature and more on learning not to fight it stupidly. One fascinating account from early frontier settlements describes newcomers attempting winter travel in ordinary leather shoes, while indigenous guides crossed the same snow effortlessly atop handmade snowshoes. Pride frequently freezes faster than toes. The mother unwraps a bundle near the shelf. Inside rests dried meat mixed with berries and fat. Pemmican, dense, rich, incredibly valuable. Many indigenous nations developed highly efficient preserved foods suited perfectly for harsh winters and long travel. Fur traders, explorers, and settlers later depended heavily on these foods because they stored well and provided enormous energy during cold weather. The younger child wrinkles their nose suspiciously at the smell. Reasonable, honestly. Frontier survival foods rarely prioritized elegance. Still, the father slices small portions carefully because every calorie matters during winter labor. Several researchers continue examining how much frontier mythology minimized indigenous contributions to settler survival techniques in later historical retellings. Popular stories often portrayed pioneers as entirely self-sufficient, despite extensive borrowing of local knowledge. Reality usually proves more complicated and more human. The mother adds strips of fur around the younger child's mittens while explaining how trapped air inside layered clothing holds warmth. Again, techniques refined through generations of winter survival long before frontier settlements spread across the plains. You notice how practical frontier clothing appears up close. Nothing decorative without purpose. Wool, fur, layered fabric, scarves wrapped repeatedly against exposed skin. Many newcomers arriving from milder climates suffered terribly because fashionable coats from eastern cities performed poorly against prairie blizzards. Winter does not care whether your buttons look sophisticated. A curious little frontier detail survives from trading posts where rabbit fur mittens became so valuable during severe winters that people traded food, tools, and ammunition for warm clothing. Frostbite turns luxury items into survival equipment very quickly. The father begins telling a story while repairing the harness. Years earlier, before this settlement existed, he travelled with a Métis guide during a winter crossing farther north. A storm struck suddenly. Visibility vanished almost immediately. The guide ordered everyone to stop moving, build snow shelter walls, and wait rather than wander blindly through open country. The father laughed softly, remembering it now. At the time, I thought he was overly cautious. You look toward the storm-scarred windows. He clearly does not think that anymore. Historical records repeatedly show that experienced indigenous travellers often understood local winter dangers far better than recent settlers or Eastern military officers unfamiliar with prairie conditions. Survival depended on humility as much as courage. The older child listens wide-eyed beside the hearth. Outside, snow slips from the roof in soft, heavy clumps under weak afternoon sunlight. Somewhere beyond the cabin, Axes ring steadily through cold air while neighbours continue clearing paths and repairing damage from the storm. The mother serves hot broth mixed with small pieces of pemmican. The flavour is richer than previous meals. The children brighten immediately. A few extra calories change moods noticeably after long, difficult days. Some academics studying frontier communities have suggested that winter cooperation occasionally created temporary spaces of cultural exchange, even during periods marked by broader violence and displacement. Shared environmental danger sometimes encouraged practical learning across cultural boundaries. Not always, not perfectly, but often enough to matter. The father finishes repairing the harness at last and hangs it near the door. The dog sleeps beside the fire, twitching occasionally while dreaming what are presumably heroic adventures involving snowdrifts and unauthorized sausage acquisition. The cabin grows dimmer as afternoon light fades early behind thick winter clouds. Already the mother begins preparing for night again. More water warming near the fire. Blankets aired briefly beside the hearth. Wet boots turned carefully to dry. The routines continue endlessly. Yet now you notice how many of those routines carry knowledge passed quietly across generations and cultures. Snowshoes by the wall, fur wrapped around small hands, preserved food stored against famine, weather signs read from the sky and animals. Survival on the frontier rarely belonged to one tradition alone, and outside the cabin, winter waits patiently across the frozen prairie, ancient and indifferent beneath the darkening sky. The younger child wakes coughing again sometime after midnight. Not loudly, just a small rough sound beneath the blankets near the hearth. Still, every adult in the cabin notices immediately. The mother sits upright before fully awake, one hand already reaching toward the child's forehead. The father lifts his head from the bedding near the wall while the dog opens one suspicious eye. Apparently concerned, the coughing may interfere with sleep schedules carefully maintained through absolutely no employment obligations whatsoever. The fire burns low again. Orange coals pulse softly beneath ash while shadows sway across the smoke-darkened ceiling. Outside, wind drifts snow gently against the cabin walls in quieter rhythms now. The storm has mostly passed, but winter itself remains. The mother touches the child's forehead carefully. Warm. Too warm. You feel the atmosphere change at once. Not panic. Something slower. Heavier. A quietly tightening concern frontier families knew well. A deeply grounded historical reality is that sickness during frontier winters frightened households enormously, because medical help often remained days away or completely unreachable after storms. Minor infections, coughs, or fevers could become life-threatening in isolated settlements lacking doctors, medicine, or safe travel conditions. The mother wraps the child more securely in blankets before placing a kettle above the coals. Steam treatment, warmth, rest, simple remedies first. The father reaches toward a shelf near the wall and removes several small cloth bundles tied carefully with string. Dried herbs, roots, bits of bark. Frontier medicine cabinets looked remarkably similar to kitchens, and occasionally suspiciously similar to gardening accidents. The mother crushes mint leaves between her fingers while another herb steeps in hot water. The smell spreads quickly through the cabin, sharp and earthy beneath the smoke. The younger child coughs again, softer this time. One intriguing frontier remedy involved placing sliced onions inside socks worn overnight during illness. The logic behind this remains medically questionable, though perhaps the smell simply convinced sickness to leave voluntarily. The older child wakes now too, blinking sleepily toward the firelight. Is he bad sick? The mother answers carefully, just cold in the chest. That phrase carried enormous emotional weight on the frontier. Chest illnesses terrified families because pneumonia spread rapidly during harsh winters, especially among children already weakened by poor nutrition or constant exposure to smoke-filled air. The father feeds more wood into the fire. No hesitation this time. Warmth matters more than fuel conservation tonight. Researchers studying frontier health records continue discussing how much indoor smoke exposure contributed to respiratory illness in isolated winter settlements. Cabins sealed tightly against cold often trapped dangerous levels of smoke and moisture indoors for months at a time. You glance upward. Even now, haze lingers faintly beneath the rafters despite the chimney drawing properly. Everyone living here breathes this air every day all winter long. The mother lifts the child closer to the fire, not too close, carefully judged. The cabin smells now of herbs, wool blankets, damp boots, and sickness beginning quietly in the dark. Outside, snow slips softly from the roof in occasional heavy thumps. The father unwraps another bundle. Willow bark, primitive pain relief long before commercial aspirin existed. Many frontier remedies blended indigenous knowledge, folk traditions, trial and error, and desperation into a complicated patchwork of survival medicine. Some treatments helped genuinely, others mostly provided emotional reassurance. And honestly, reassurance matters more than modern people sometimes admit. The younger child finally drinks a little hot broth mixed with herbs. The mother strokes damp hair gently away from the forehead while humming under her breath. The melody stays low enough almost to disappear beneath the crackling fire. Several historians examining frontier family life have noted how much medical care depended upon women's accumulated practical knowledge inside isolated households. Mothers, grandmothers, and older relatives often served as nurses, pharmacists, and emergency caregivers during long winters when outside help remained impossible. The father sharpens the poker absent-mindedly beside the hearth, steel scraping softly against stone, not because the poker needs sharpening particularly, because worried people need tasks for their hands. The older child watches silently from beneath blankets. Children on the frontier learned early that illness changed household rhythms. Voices lowered, movements slowed. Adults exchanged meaningful glances across rooms while pretending everything remained ordinary. One especially strange frontier cure recommended placing goose grease on the chest beneath heated flannel cloth to treat coughs. Whether medically effective or not, frontier medicine certainly ensured people smelled memorable during recovery. The younger child's breathing eases slightly after a while. The mother relaxes only a little. Frontier nights taught caution. Symptoms could worsen quickly once darkness settled and temperatures dropped hardest before dawn. You sit listening to the cabin around you, the steady crackle of fire, the occasional cough, wind whispering faintly outside, a horse shifting somewhere in the shed beyond the walls. Human survival often sounds surprisingly soft. A number of scholars continue exploring how emotional isolation shaped frontier experiences of sickness and grief. Families frequently handled severe illness alone without professional support, relying heavily on one another inside cramped cabins where every sound and symptom became impossible to ignore. The father eventually rises and opens the door briefly despite the cold. Fresh air sweeps inward, carrying sharp, snow-scented wind through the cabin. Smoke clears slightly. Frost sparkles along the threshold beneath moonlight reflecting off endless drifts outside. Then the door closes again quickly. The younger child sleeps at last against the mother's shoulder, breathing easier now though still uneven. The mother does not return fully to bed. Instead, she remains beside the hearth wrapped in a blanket, keeping watch beside the fire. The father sits nearby. Neither speaks much. They simply listen, waiting, monitoring each breath while night stretches long round the little cabin. Outside, the frontier lies silent beneath deep snow and frozen stars. Somewhere beyond the settlement, wolves move across the drifts beneath pale moonlight. Somewhere farther still, more storms gather eventually beyond the horizon. But inside this smoke-stained room, one family keeps vigil beside a weak winter fire while a child sleeps wrapped in blankets and borrowed warmth against the cold. By the next evening, the younger child's fever has eased slightly, not gone, but lower. The mother finally sleeps for a few hours beside the hearth, while the father watches the fire and listens to the child breathe. Frontier families became experts at sleeping in fragments during difficult winters. A little rest here, a little there, Human beings can survive astonishing exhaustion when necessary, though admittedly they become less charming conversationalists in the process. Outside, the sky is cleared completely. Cold deepens after storms. Moonlight spreads across the prairie so brightly that snowdrifts almost glow blue beyond the cabin windows. Every sound carries farther now in the frozen stillness. You hear distant axes, muffled voices, and once, far away, the lonely cry of a coyote moving somewhere beyond the settlement. Inside, the cabin feels crowded tonight. Not unpleasantly crowded, just full. The dog sleeps beside the children as usual, though now 2 chickens occupy a basket near the hearth too. The mother brought them indoors after discovering frost forming inside the coop despite extra straw insulation. The chickens seemed deeply offended by civilization in general. A reliably documented feature of frontier winters was the frequent blending of human and animal spaces during severe weather. Families often brought smaller livestock indoors temporarily to prevent freezing, theft, or illness. Chickens, newborn animals, and even weak calves sometimes shared living quarters with humans during brutal cold snaps. The result smelled exactly as you might imagine. The father wrinkles his nose while adjusting another log in the fire. Nobody complains, though. Egg-laying hens meant food. Food meant survival. Frontier practicality often defeated aesthetic preferences with remarkable speed. The younger child wakes long enough to laugh sleepily when one chicken flutters its wings inside the basket. The sound lightens the entire room for a moment. The mother smiles tiredly. That smile matters. Winter cabins depended emotionally on tiny moments of humour. Without them, endless cold and confinement could wear people down steadily day after day. One odd little frontier practice involved hanging blankets around indoor animal baskets to trap extra warmth overnight. Imagine trying to explain to modern interior designers that your bedroom currently includes decorative poultry curtains for survival reasons. The father removes snow-crusted boots near the doorway. His socks steam faintly beside the hearth, while the older child helps brush snow from a saddle blanket drying overhead. Every available space inside the cabin now serves multiple purposes. Cooking area, sick room, laundry line, animal shelter. The cabin itself feels alive somehow, breathing heat, holding smells, protecting fragile warmth against the frozen dark outside. Several historians examining frontier domestic life have observed that modern romantic depictions often overlook how physically close people and animals lived during difficult seasons. Barns leaked heat. Livestock weakened quickly in storms. Bringing animals closer sometimes became the safest option despite sanitation problems. And sanitation definitely existed more as an ambitious suggestion than a consistent reality. The dog suddenly lifts its head and growls softly toward the door. Everyone pauses. A knock follows moments later. 3 quick strikes against the wood. The father opens the door cautiously. A neighbour stands outside, wrapped heavily in scarves, snow glittering across his coat beneath moonlight. He carries a sack over one shoulder and stomps ice from his boots before entering. Fresh potatoes in exchange for extra lamp oil. Trade continues even after storms because survival rarely allows complete self-sufficiency. The neighbour settles briefly near the fire, rubbing frozen hands together while steam rises from his coat. He smells sharply of cold air, horses, and wood smoke. Frontier winter scents travelled indoors with everyone. The chickens mutter unhappily from their basket. The neighbour laughs softly. House looks crowded. The father glances around the cabin. Still warmer than the shed, nobody argues. A well-supported historical pattern across frontier settlements involved constant informal exchange between neighbours during winter months. Food, tools, medicine ingredients, sewing supplies, and labour moved quietly between households according to need. Communities surviving harsh winters often depended on flexible cooperation rather than strict accounting. The neighbour mentions another storm possibly arriving within days. Everyone grows quieter immediately. The father stares into the fire. The mother checks supplies almost unconsciously with her eyes. flour, potatoes, woodpile near the wall. Winter teaches people to calculate continuously. The older child feeds scraps to the chickens carefully while the dog watches with visible professional jealousy. One amusing frontier anecdote describes families hanging bird cages near indoor livestock specifically because chickens became calmer, hearing songbirds during storms. Whether scientifically sound or not, the image of frontier settlers managing poultry emotional wellness during blizzards feels strangely endearing. The neighbour eventually leaves carrying lamp oil wrapped beneath his coat. Cold air sweeps briefly through the cabin again before the door closes tightly behind him. Outside, moonlit snow stretches silent and endless beneath the stars. The younger child coughs once but settles quickly afterward. Better. You can hear it now. The mother relaxes slightly for the first time in days. Some researchers continue discussing how frontier families maintained emotional balance during long winters of isolation and confinement. Crowded cabins, illness, food anxiety, and constant labour created enormous psychological pressure. Yet many households developed routines and humour that softened tension enough to endure. Inside this cabin, even the animals contribute somehow. A soft clucking from the basket, the dog sighing beside the hearth, the horse shifting faintly in the shed outside, life surrounding life against the cold. The fire burns steadily tonight, not strong enough to waste comfort carelessly, but stable. Orange light flickers across patched quilts, hanging clothes, and tired faces while frost thickens quietly along the windows. The mother finally lies down fully beside the children. The father remains awake a little longer watching the embers. Beyond the cabin walls, winter still rules the frontier completely. Snow covers roads, fields, fences, and distant hills beneath pale moonlight. But inside this cramped, glowing room filled with people, animals, steam, smoke, and stubborn endurance, warmth still survives another night. The next storm does not arrive immediately. That alone feels like a gift. 3 calmer days settle over the frontier settlement, cold but manageable. Smoke rises steadily from chimneys beneath pale winter skies. Paths between cabins grow more defined as neighbours continue stamping trails through the deep snow. Life regains rhythm again, and with rhythm comes evening, long frontier evenings. The kind stretching endlessly between sunset and sleep while darkness gathers outside by late afternoon. Winter nights on the plains could feel almost oceanic in length, hours upon hours surrounded by wind, frost, and isolation. So people filled the darkness however they could. Tonight, the fire burns stronger than usual. The father managed to split drier wood from deeper inside the pile, and the difference shows immediately. Flames crackle brighter. Heat reaches farther across the room. Even the windows carry less frost around their edges. The younger child sits wrapped in blankets but no longer feverish. Better now. Still weak. The mother keeps touching the child's forehead anyway, because parents rarely stop worrying immediately after danger passes. The chickens remain indoors for another night, though their basket has been moved farther from the table after one particularly ambitious attempt at exploring supper preparations yesterday. The dog watches them suspiciously from beside the hearth like an underpaid sheriff maintaining order in a deeply disorganized frontier town. A broadly recognized feature of frontier winter life was the importance of storytelling, music, games, and shared rituals during long periods of confinement. Entertainment was not merely distraction. It preserved morale, reinforced community bonds, and helped people endure isolation during severe weather. The father lifts the fiddle again tonight, still missing one string, still beautiful somehow. He tunes it slowly while the older child leans closer beside the fire. The mother continues sewing by lantern light, though you notice she works more slowly now, listening. Outside, wind drifts softly across the cabin roof. Inside, the first notes rise warm and low through the smoky air. Not polished music, human music. Music played by tired hands after long labour. the melody carries something deeply comforting in its imperfections. Frontier entertainment rarely depended on technical perfection. It depended on presence, shared experience, the simple relief of hearing something other than storms and coughing. One little-known frontier pastime involved families competing in memory games where children repeated increasingly long lists of supplies, animals, or Bible verses during winter evenings. Early educational entertainment apparently operated on the exciting principle of turning exhaustion into group homework. The older child begins humming softly with the tune. Then the mother joins quietly too. Even the younger child smiles sleepily beneath the blankets. The cabin changes when people sing together. The walls feel less tight somehow. The darkness outside less immense. Several scholars examining frontier social history have proposed that music and storytelling served critical psychological functions in isolated settlements. Shared rituals reduced loneliness and reminded families they belonged to something larger than endless snow and daily survival. The father lowers the fiddle after a while and begins telling a story instead. Not a grand heroic tale. A funny one about a traveller years earlier who tied himself to a mule during a blizzard to avoid getting lost, and later discovered the mule had wandered directly into a frozen creek. The older child laughs loudly. The mother shakes her head, smiling. The father insists the story is entirely true, which immediately makes everyone suspect otherwise. Frontier humour often revolved around discomfort, weather disasters, stubborn animals, and questionable decision-making. Considering the circumstances, this seems emotionally healthy. The fire pops sharply beside you. Orange light flickers across the low ceiling beams while steam rises faintly from drying mittens near the hearth. Outside, snow glows pale blue beneath moonlight filtering through thin clouds. The mother sets aside her sewing finally. Needles and thread return carefully into the wooden box near the shelf. Nothing small gets misplaced during frontier winters because replacing even simple household items could prove difficult once roads vanished beneath snow. A charmingly strange frontier custom involved shadow plays beside cabin walls during winter nights. Parents projected animal shapes using lantern light to entertain children, while storms raged outside. Primitive cinema, perhaps, though with significantly more frostbite risk during intermission. The father demonstrates now, shaping rough bird forms against the wall with his hands while the younger child giggles quietly beneath the blankets. For a moment, the cabin feels almost ordinary, almost cozy. You realize how hard people worked to create that feeling. Warmth did not happen naturally here. Neither did comfort. Families built both deliberately from tiny rituals repeated night after night. Researchers continue debating how much emotional memory softened frontier recollections later in life. Many elderly settlers described winter evenings nostalgically decades afterward despite surviving severe hardship. Perhaps human beings naturally polish difficult memories until suffering begins resembling warmth, viewed from a safe distance. The mother pours weak tea into cups again. The father shares the last spoonful of molasses between the children. Tiny luxuries, tiny celebrations. Outside, the prairie stretches frozen and silent beyond the windows. Wolves move somewhere far away beneath moonlit snow. Trees creak softly in the cold. Another storm will eventually come because winter always returns. But tonight there is music, laughter, stories repeated beside a reliable fire. The older child yawns enormously before trying unsuccessfully to hide it. The father smiles and lifts the fiddle one last time, while the mother pulls blankets higher around the younger child's shoulders. The tune he plays now sounds slower, gentler, almost sleepy itself. The dog sighs heavily beside the hearth. The chickens mutter faintly from their basket. Lantern light glows soft against smoke-stained walls while snow drifts quietly beyond the glass. And inside this crowded little cabin on the frozen frontier, one family pushes back the winter darkness not with strength alone, but with songs, stories, and the stubborn decision to remain human beside the fire. The news arrives just after sunrise. A rider appears slowly through the snow-covered trail beyond the settlement, horse moving carefully across frozen drifts while steam rises from both animal and rider into the pale morning air. You notice immediately how tired the horse looks, head low, frost gathered thick along its mane. The father steps outside before the rider even reaches the cabin. Something feels wrong. The rider removes one glove with stiff fingers and speaks quietly. You cannot hear every word from the doorway, but you catch enough. Cabin north of the river, no smoke for 2 days, a family missing. The mother lowers the spoon she's been using to stir breakfast. Silence settles heavily through the room. Frontier winters carried this possibility constantly. Storms did not merely inconvenience people, they erased them sometimes. Cabins buried beneath drifts, travellers frozen along trails, families trapped without fuel or food until help arrived too late. An established historical reality from many frontier regions is that winter death often came quietly rather than dramatically. Exposure, starvation, illness, and isolation work slowly across remote settlement where assistance could remain days away, even in good weather. The father prepares immediately. Heavy coat, snowshoes, lantern, extra rope. The rider drinks hot broth quickly beside the hearth, before joining him again outside. Another neighbour arrives carrying a shovel over one shoulder. Search parties formed quickly after storms because survival windows narrowed fast in freezing temperatures. The mother wraps extra scarves around the father's neck without speaking much. No dramatic farewell, just practical movements hiding worry. You follow the men into the snow. The morning sky hangs pale grey above endless white fields glittering beneath weak sunlight. Snowshoes creak softly with each step while cold air bites exposed skin almost immediately. The settlement disappears behind you faster than expected. That always surprises modern minds. How quickly wilderness swallowed small frontier communities. One unusual account from the northern plains describes searchers locating a missing barn only because the tops of buried fence posts created faint bumps beneath drifting snow. Entire buildings vanished during severe winters as though the landscape itself had decided to smooth away human effort. The rider leads the way north. Frozen trees line part of the trail near the riverbank where snow lies deeper between bare branches. Every sound feels muted except for boots, breath, and distant wind moving across open prairie. The men speak little. Searching demands attention. You begin noticing how difficult winter travel truly becomes after storms. Drifts hide holes, fallen branches, frozen creek edges, distant stretches strangely across snowfields. Cabins that seem close often remain miles away through deep powder. Several historians studying frontier mortality records continue debating how many winter deaths went undocumented across isolated territories, where entire families sometimes disappeared without nearby witnesses. Sparse populations and severe weather complicated accurate record-keeping enormously. Ahead, the rider suddenly stops. You see it then, a roof corner barely visible above drifting snow. The cabin, or what remains visible of it. The men move faster now. Snow reaches nearly to the windows. One side of the roof has partially collapsed beneath heavy accumulation. No smoke rises from the chimney. The father shouts toward the buried doorway. Nothing answers. The search party begins digging immediately. Shovels strike packed snow with dull, heavy sounds while breath steams thickly through scarps. The work feels exhausting almost at once. Snow compacted by wind hardens like damp sand. Finally, the doorway appears, frozen shut. The father forces it inward with his shoulder. Darkness waits inside, cold darker somehow than ordinary darkness. The lantern swings forward, revealing overturned chairs, scattered blankets, frost-coated walls. Snow has drifted through gaps in the collapsed roof onto the floor below. No movement. The air smells bitterly cold and stale. Then from the far corner, a sound. Weak coughing. Alive. The father reaches the back room quickly, where an elderly woman lies wrapped beneath quilts beside a dead stove. Her face appears pale beneath frost-rimmed blankets, but her eyes open slowly at the lantern light. Alive, only barely. A remarkable but true detail from frontier rescue accounts describes people surviving astonishing conditions by insulating themselves beneath layers of bedding, clothing, and even furniture when fires failed during storms. Human bodies cling fiercely to life when shelter blocks enough wind. The men carry the woman carefully from the cabin wrapped in blankets and buffalo robes. She weighs almost nothing. Outside, sunlight reflects painfully bright across the snow. The rider explains quietly that her son likely attempted reaching the settlement for help during the worst part of the storm several days earlier. He never returned. Nobody says the obvious possibility aloud. Searchers understood what deep snow and freezing wind often meant. The father studies the surrounding drifts silently for several moments before speaking. We keep looking. So they do. Hours pass slowly beneath the cold sky while the men spread outward across the snowfields searching for tracks, broken branches, anything unusual beneath the drifts. The dog from another homestead runs ahead, sniffing constantly through the snow. Occasionally it barks at buried logs with enormous confidence and absolutely no useful results. They're near a frozen stand of brush beside the riverbank. One searcher raises an arm. Everyone hurries over. A shape lies partly buried beneath drifting snow. Still, silent. The father removes his hat slowly. You look away toward the frozen river glittering under pale afternoon sunlight. Frontier winters rarely offered dramatic endings. No music, no speeches, just cold silence settling over the snow. Some modern scholars examining pioneer narratives suggest later generations often transform these losses into simplified heroic stories because the ordinary reality felt too bleak. Isolation, exhaustion, and bad luck killed many people as effectively as storms themselves. The search party returns toward the settlement before dusk, carrying the rescued woman carefully on a sled. Smoke rises from distant chimneys ahead. Warmth waiting. The father walks silently beside the sled while snow squeaks beneath the runners. Behind you. The buried cabin sits alone beneath the fading winter light, slowly disappearing once more into the endless frozen prairie. Winter does not end all at once. That may be the strangest part. After months of storms, deep drifts, frozen windows, and endless grey skies, you expect spring to arrive dramatically. Trumpets, perhaps. Birds singing triumphantly across green hills. The frontier, however, prefers messier transitions. The first sign appears in sound. Dripping water. You hear it one morning before sunrise while the cabin still sits mostly dark around the dying coals. A faint tapping outside the window. Slow, irregular. Meltwater. The mother hears it too and pauses while wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. Nobody smiles immediately. Frontier families knew false springs existed. Warm days arrived early, sometimes only to vanish beneath fresh blizzards a week later. Winter enjoyed emotional manipulation nearly as much as physical suffering. Still, something has changed. Outside, dawn reveals patches of dark earth emerging beside the cabin foundation, where snow has begun shrinking away from the walls. The drifts remain enormous across the prairie, but their edges look softer now, less permanent. The air smells different too. Wet, heavy, alive somehow beneath the cold. A carefully documented feature of frontier life was the enormous difficulty caused by spring thaw after severe winters. Melting snow transformed roads into mud fields, flooded rivers, collapsed roofs weakened by ice, and exposed months of accumulated waste around settlements. Winter buried problems beautifully. Spring uncovered them all again. The father steps outside carrying a shovel. Not for snow this time, for drainage. Water already pools near the cabin where meltwater slides from the roof. If allowed to collect too close to the foundation, it could seep beneath floorboards and weaken the structure. The dog splashes enthusiastically through mud moments later, because every frontier spring apparently required at least one animal fully committed to chaos. Inside, the cabin feels damper than before. The fire still burns, but less constantly now. Windows open slightly during warmer afternoons to clear months of trapped smoke and stale air. Fresh wind moves through the room, carrying scents of wet earth and melting snow. The children notice first: restlessness. They want outdoors again after long confinement. The older child stands at the doorway, staring toward the muddy trail between cabins, while the younger one presses small hands against the window, watching water drip steadily from the roof edge. One curious frontier observation from travellers described spring settlements smelling simultaneously wonderful and horrifying. Fresh grass mixed with mud, livestock waste, damp wool, smoke residue, thawing garbage, and standing water into an aroma modern tourism brochures would struggle to market successfully. The mother begins dragging blankets outdoors whenever sunlight appears. She hangs them across fence rails to air out months of smoke and winter dampness. The sight changes the settlement immediately, bright quilts fluttering against lingering snowdrifts beneath pale blue skies. Signs of survival. Several historians examining frontier domestic routines have emphasized how exhausting spring cleanup became after harsh winters. Cabins required repairs, clothing needed washing, water damage appeared everywhere. Livestock weakened from months indoors often required extra care. Winter ending did not mean work ending. Quite the opposite. The father climbs onto the roof carefully one afternoon to inspect storm damage. Snowmelt drips steadily from the eaves around him, while the mother watches nervously from below. Several shingles warped. One support beam cracked slightly. Nothing catastrophic. Yet, frontier buildings aged brutally beneath constant exposure to snow, wind, and freezing temperatures. Entire settlements entered spring already partially exhausted before planting season even began. The younger child coughs less now. Colour has returned to those cheeks at last. The mother finally laughs properly one evening while washing dishes beside an open window. The sound startles everyone slightly because tension had settled so deeply into the household during winter that joy itself feels unfamiliar. A lesser-known frontier practice involved collecting meltwater from roofs during early spring for washing clothes and cleaning cabins after months of smoke build-up. Nature provided water delivery services briefly before mud season destroyed transportation entirely, and mud season absolutely deserves its terrible reputation. You step outside after several warmer days and immediately sink ankle-deep beside the woodpile. The settlement pathways transform into slippery brown trenches bordered by shrinking walls of dirty snow. Wagons struggle terribly once thaw begins. Horses fare little better. The dog returns from one outdoor expedition coated in mud, with the expression of a creature who considers this development magnificent. The father does not share that opinion after cleaning muddy paw prints from the cabin floor. Scholars continue discussing how seasonal transitions shaped frontier psychology, particularly the emotional release many families experienced after surviving difficult winters. Diaries often describe intense relief during early spring, even while practical hardships continued. You understand why now. The sky itself looks larger somehow once storms stop dominating every thought. Birds return gradually too. Crows first, then smaller birds flickering through bare trees near the riverbank. Their song sounds strange after months dominated by wind and silence. One afternoon, the father discovers green shoots emerging beside the cabin where snow melted earliest. Tiny things, fragile, yet the entire family gathers briefly to look at them. Proof. Winter can retreat after all. Inside the cabin, changes continue slowly. Heavy blankets fold away during warmer afternoons. The chickens finally return permanently to the coop outside. Windows stay open longer. Smoke stains seem less oppressive once sunlight enters more freely. Still, traces of winter remain everywhere. Wood stacked carefully against future storms. Scarred hands, thin food supplies, quiet habits built through long months of caution. The settlement itself feels older now somehow, more tired perhaps, yet also more alive. Water drips steadily from rooftops while muddy trails connect cabins once isolated by snow. Voices travel farther through the warmer air. Somewhere nearby, someone begins repairing a wagon wheel beside the road, and beneath the slowly brightening frontier sky, families who endured another deadly winter step cautiously towards spring, carrying smoke, exhaustion, grief, and stubborn relief with them into the thaw. Spring does not truly fix anything. It only reveals what winter was hiding. That realization arrives slowly across the settlement as thaw continues. Mud deepens into thick brown channels between cabins. Roof repairs multiply. Damp wood stacks require constant attention. Every surface seems to breathe moisture after months of freezing stillness. Yet people move differently now. Lighter, more openly, the father spends entire mornings repairing structural damage, while the mother reorganizes the cabin with renewed energy that feels almost unfamiliar after winter's confinement. Even the children wander farther from the doorway without constant supervision, their voices carrying across open air instead of being swallowed by snow. A mainstream historical fact about frontier life is that spring marked one of the busiest and most physically demanding periods of the entire year. After surviving winter, families immediately transitioned into repairing homes, preparing soil, planting crops, and rebuilding supply lines before the next seasonal cycle began. Rest did not follow survival. Work did. You notice how the settlement changes in layers. First the snow disappears, then the mud dominates everything. Then gradually, green begins to return in scattered patches across the prairie. The mother points out early wild onions growing near the creek one morning. The children immediately rush to inspect them with the seriousness of explorers discovering new continents. Frontier diets often relied on early spring foraging to supplement dwindling winter stores before crops matured. One quirky tidbit from frontier records describes children competing to find the first edible greens each spring, sometimes treating it like a seasonal competition judged by which family could produce the earliest fresh meal. Hunger has a way of turning botany into sport. The father rebuilds sections of fence damaged by drifting snow, while speaking occasionally with neighbours doing the same along the shared boundary lines. Conversation flows more easily now. Winter isolation loosens its grip as travel becomes possible again. Historians still argue whether the emotional relief of spring was more psychological or physical in nature for frontier families. Some suggest it stemmed primarily from improved nutrition and mobility, while others emphasize the mental strain of prolonged confinement finally lifting after months indoors. Perhaps it was both, or something harder to define. The river near the settlement begins to swell as ice breaks apart upstream. Large fragments drift slowly beneath widening currents, while birds gather along the banks. Water noise replaces silence in the landscape. The sound itself feels like change made audible. The mother begins washing winter bedding outdoors in large basins, scrubbing away smoke and dust accumulated over months. Steam rises faintly in morning air even though temperatures are no longer harsh. Sunlight dries fabric faster now, and the sight of clean cloth hanging outside feels almost symbolic. The older child helps carry water repeatedly from the creek while complaining lightly about the weight, though noticeably with far more energy than during winter months. The younger child spends more time outside, chasing insects or simply standing still watching everything as though the world is restarted. One historical observation about frontier communities notes that spring often brought both relief and vulnerability. While food production began again, families also faced risks from flooding, weakened infrastructure, and renewed travel hazards as roads turned unstable from thawing ground. Nothing becomes simple, it only becomes different. The father takes the dog toward higher ground one afternoon to check remaining snow pockets. In shaded areas, ice still clings stubbornly beneath rocks and tree roots. Spring advances unevenly across the landscape. creating a patchwork of seasons overlapping each other. Winter refusing to fully disappear. Summer not yet present, only transition. The settlement begins preparing fields nearby. Soil turns under shovels for planting. Seeds are counted carefully again, though in a different way than winter rationing. Now the calculations shift toward growth instead of survival. Scholars continue discussing how frontier families psychologically adapted to this cyclical rhythm of scarcity and renewal. Many accounts suggest people developed an acute awareness of time tied not to calendars, but to agricultural necessity and weather patterns. Life was measured in seasons that demanded participation. You stand near the edge of the settlement watching the river carry broken ice downstream. The sound is constant now, filling the valley with motion after months of silence. A quirky detail from some frontier diaries mentions settlers celebrating the first clear flowing water of spring by simply sitting near rivers for hours listening. No ceremony, no ritual, just quiet observation of movement returning to frozen worlds. The mother joins you briefly at the riverbank. She says nothing at first, then simply watches the water. The wind feels warmer now against your face, though traces of cold still linger in shaded places. Snow remains in distant hollows but no longer dominates the horizon. The land looks uncertain, like it is remembering how to be something other than frozen. Inside the cabin, winter tools are gradually stored away, heavier coats folded, thick curtains removed, firewood use decreases slightly, though not entirely. Frontier spring still carries cold nights. The father repairs the last section of fence late one afternoon and pauses to look across the open prairie stretching beyond the settlement. Far away, grass begins to return in faint green lines. He exhales slowly. A well-documented reality of frontier existence is that survival never ended with winter's passing. Instead, it transformed into preparation for the next cycle. Planting, repairing, building, storing, and anticipating future cold seasons remained constant responsibilities. The children run past him laughing loudly through shallow puddles. This sound carries far across the open land, and for the first time in months, the frontier does not feel entirely hostile, only vast, only waiting. By late spring, the settlement begins to feel like a different place entirely, even though nothing about its location has changed. The same cabins remain, the same river flows nearby, the same wide prairie stretches outward in every direction. Yet the feeling of the land shifts, as if winter has finally stepped back far enough to stop pressing its weight against every wooden wall and human thought. Mud still dominates the paths between homes, thick and stubborn, clinging to boots and wagon wheels alike. But now it carries life in it too. Small plants push through softened ground. Grass returns in uneven patches. Birds circle more often above the rooftops, no longer absent but present, noisy and unafraid. Inside the cabin, the fire is used less frequently during the day. The mother opens windows fully now, letting fresh air replace months of smoke trapped in timber and cloth. The smell of winter fades slowly, replaced by something cleaner, though still earthy and raw. The father spends most days outside repairing what winter damaged. Fence lines are rebuilt, tools are sharpened, roof shingles replaced where ice and wind tore them loose. A mainstream historical fact about frontier communities is that spring maintenance often required more labour than the entire winter season combined, because everything that survived cold months still needed repair before planting and travel could resume fully. There is no pause, only transition into another form of work. You walk with the father one morning along the edge of the settlement where fields are being prepared. Soil turns over in dark strips, releasing smells that feel almost shocking after months of frozen air. Horses pull ploughs slowly through earth that resists at first, then yields. Farm work begins again, not gently, demandingly. A quirky tidbit from frontier diaries mentions that some children believe the first ploughed soil of spring was awake dirt, as if the ground itself had been sleeping during winter and was now stretching back into motion. Adults never corrected this too harshly, perhaps because it was not entirely wrong in feeling. Life does seem to return from sleep. The older child runs ahead along the field edges, collecting early flowers that appear in sheltered spots. The younger child follows more slowly, stopping often to inspect insects emerging from under stones and logs. Everything small feels important again. Meanwhile, the mother begins preparing seed stores inside the cabin, carefully sorting through what remains from winter. Grain, beans, and preserved seeds are checked one by one. Some are set aside for planting, others for food. Every decision carries consequence because nothing can be wasted at this stage of the year. Scholars still debate how much frontier agricultural success depended on experience versus sheer environmental luck in early settlement years, since soil quality, rainfall timing, and early frost conditions could determine entire seasons of survival or failure. Even skilled farmers could lose everything to unpredictable weather shifts. Outdoors, the river's fully broken now. Ice is gone completely. Water moves fast and loud, carrying debris from upstream forests. The sound of it replaces the silence that dominated winter months, and in some strange way it makes the entire landscape feel larger, more open, less compressed. You sit with the father near a newly repaired fence line one afternoon while he watches the fields quietly. He does not speak for a long time. Then he says something simple. Winter always feels longer when you're inside it. He does not explain further. He does not need to. A widely recognised observation from frontier diaries is that memory of winter often softened over time, especially in older settlers' accounts. Hardships were remembered, but the emotional edges became smoother, sometimes even nostalgic. Once survival was no longer in immediate danger, time reshapes suffering, not into something pleasant, but into something survivable to remember. Across the settlement, rebuilding continues. Smoke rises less frequently during daylight. Water barrels are moved outside again. Children begin helping with small tasks in fields and gardens. The entire community shifts into coordinated effort, each household contributing to shared survival through planting and repair. A strange frontier detail appears in several accounts describing spring evenings when settlers would sit outside after long days of work simply to feel wind without fear. No storm approaching, no immediate danger, just air moving freely across open land. The sensation itself felt unusual after months of confinement. The mother joins you at sunset near the cabin. She carries a cloth bundle of cleaned blankets now dried in open air. The fabric smells faintly of sun and wind instead of smoke and frost. She pauses beside you without speaking, watching the horizon where light stretches across fields newly turned for planting. The father finishes work late that evening and returns covered in soil and dust rather than snow. He looks different now compared to winter months, less tightened, less guarded, as if his body is remembering a wider range of movement again. Dinner is eaten outside for the first time. Simple food, bread, boiled vegetables, fresh air all around. The children laugh more easily now, voices carrying across open space instead of being contained within walls. The dog runs farther than usual before returning, fully convinced that the world belongs entirely to it again. Yet even in this gentler season, there remains awareness. Memory of winter is still close, stored in wood piles, in repaired beams, in cautious glances toward the sky when clouds gather. The prairie never forgets how to freeze, only pauses. As night falls, the settlement glows softly with scattered lamplight rather than enclosed firelight. Houses feel less like sealed shelters and more like resting places between seasons. You look across the fields stretching into dusk. The land is no longer white, not yet fully green, somewhere in between. And in that in-between space, frontier life continues, not as survival against winter alone, but as constant negotiation with a world that never stays still for long. By early summer, The prairie finally feels like it has fully exhaled. Grass stretches across the land in wide green waves, no longer interrupted by endless white. Wildflowers appear in scattered bursts of colour along the riverbanks. The air itself feels softer now, carrying warmth that does not threaten to vanish overnight. The settlement changes with it. Doors stay open longer during the day. Children run freely between cabins without heavy coats. Animals graze farther from fences, no longer confined by snow or fear of sudden storms. Even the soundscape transforms. Instead of wind howling across empty frozen ground, there are insects now, birds, water moving steadily through the river without obstruction. Inside the cabin, life feels almost unrecognizable compared to winter. Light enters from every window. Smoke is rare. Fire is only used when necessary, more for cooking than survival. The heavy quilts that once defined every night are folded and stored, replaced by lighter bedding that no longer feels like armour. A mainstream historical fact about frontier communities is that summer was not a season of rest, but of intense labour, because the entire survival cycle depended on preparing food stores, repairing structures, harvesting early crops, and securing resources for the next winter long before it arrived. Nothing ever truly stopped, it only changed direction. You walk with the family along the edge of newly growing fields where crops are beginning to take root. Rows of planted seeds stretch across the soil, carefully aligned by hand and experience. The father checks irrigation channels near the creek while the mother inspects young shoots emerging from the ground. Life is small again, but in a different way than winter. Not compressed, expanding. The children chase each other through tall grass near the settlement edge, laughing without hesitation now. Their voices carry far across open land, unbroken by walls or storm or fear of silence. A quirky tidbit from Frontier Diaries describes how some families believed the first full bloom of summer flowers marked a kind of return of the land's memory, as if the earth itself remembered how to grow after forgetting it during winter's long grip. The belief sounds poetic, but it also reflects how deeply seasonal cycles shaped daily thought. Everything was observed. Everything meant something. The father repairs a final section of fence that winter storms had repeatedly damaged. He works slowly now, not from exhaustion, but from calm repetition. The urgency of survival has faded into steady maintenance. Nearby, neighbours call across fields discussing harvest plans, livestock and shared labour. The settlement feels more connected in summer, less isolated, as roads remain open and travel becomes easier. Scholars still debate how much frontier communities psychologically depended on seasonal relief cycles to maintain long-term resilience, since the contrast between brutal winters and productive summers may have reinforced both endurance and optimism in equal measure. The rhythm itself shaped identity. You sit near the riverbank in the afternoon watching water move freely again. Sunlight reflects off the surface in shifting patterns that feel almost unfamiliar after months of icebound silence. The sound of flowing water replaces memory of frozen stillness. The mother sits beside you quietly. She says nothing for a long time. Then she looks across the fields and simply remarks that everything feels louder now. She's right. Summer has volume. Wind through grass, birds calling from distant trees, tools striking wood in steady rhythm across the settlement. Even silence now feels different, less heavy, more open. A lesser-known frontier detail appears in many agricultural records describing how families often mark the arrival of summer, not by dates, but by specific natural changes such as consistent bird migrations, soil temperature, and the first reliable warm rains that allowed planting to continue without interruption. Time was not measured on paper alone, it was read from the land. As evening approaches, the family gathers outside the cabin once more. Food is simpler now, but more varied. Fresh vegetables from early gardens appear alongside preserved winter stores that are finally being used up. The dog lies in the shade watching everything with content approval. as though it has personally overseen the successful transition from winter catastrophe to summer order. The children fall asleep later than before, unwilling to leave the daylight that stretches so long into evening now. There is no urgency to retreat indoors, no storm pressing against the horizon, only warm air and fading light. A father sits beside the fire as it burns low, more for comfort than necessity. The mother folds clothing nearby while occasionally glancing at the sleeping children. Beyond the settlement, the prairie extends endlessly under a wide sky glowing with the last colours of sunset. The same land that buried them in snow now holds them in green. You realise something quietly in that moment. Frontier life was never defined by one season alone. It was defined by the constant turning between extremes, endurance and cold, labour and warmth, memory in between. And as night settles gently over the summer prairie, the fire dims slowly while the world outside remains open, breathing, and alive in a way that feels almost forgiving. Sweet dreams.